Open any history book. Find the chapter on France. Now look for the 300 years that vanished. They're not there, and there's a reason why. Most of us learn history the same way. We memorize dates, empires, and names. Rome falls in 476. Charlemagne rises around 800. Between those points, there's a blur. Teachers call it the Dark Ages. Textbooks use words like chaotic and obscure. We're taught to imagine wandering tribes, burning villages, and the slow collapse of civilization. The narrative is simple. Rome crumbled, and Europe stumbled through darkness until medieval kings brought order again. But here's what they don't tell you. In the territory we now call France, something else existed during those centuries. Not chaos, not emptiness, an empire. A functioning, sophisticated empire with kings who commanded armies, minted currency, built churches, and wielded authority that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Byzantium. This wasn't a footnote. This wasn't a tribal confederation scraping by in Roman ruins. This was a dynasty that ruled for nearly 3 centuries, and their influence shaped the entire foundation of medieval Europe. Yet when you sit down with a standard history textbook, you'll find perhaps 2 paragraphs dedicated to this era. Maybe 3 if the book is generous. The language is always cautious, always vague. Historians write about fragmentary evidence and limited sources. They describe the period as poorly documented or difficult to reconstruct. The impression they create is clear. Nothing important happened here. These centuries were a void, a historical blank space where Europe simply waited for something better to come along. Except thousands of documents survive from this period. Archaeological sites dot the landscape. Coins still exist, stamped with the faces of forgotten kings. Churches stand that were commissioned by rulers whose names most people have never heard. The evidence isn't missing. The evidence is everywhere. So why does the official narrative treat these centuries like an embarrassing gap in an otherwise coherent story? Think about what you learned in school. You studied Julius Caesar. You learned about Constantine and the Christianization of Rome. Then suddenly the timeline jumps forward 300 years to Charlemagne, crowned emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. The story picks up again, as if nothing came before him, as if he emerged from a vacuum to create medieval Europe from scratch. But Charlemagne didn't create anything from nothing. He conquered something. He overthrew something. And that something was an empire that had been thriving for centuries before he arrived. This is where the mystery deepens. History textbooks don't usually erase empires. They love empires. Empires provide structure, narrative, drama. Empires give students something to memorize and teachers something to test. So when an empire that lasted 300 years gets reduced to a whisper in the historical record, you have to ask why. When the dynasty that built the foundation of France itself becomes a name most people have never encountered, you have to wonder what made them so dangerous to remember. This wasn't an absence of history. This was something more deliberate. This was selection. Someone decided which parts of the past would be illuminated and which would remain in shadow. Someone chose to emphasize certain kings while burying others. And if you look closely at who did the choosing and when they did it, patterns emerge. Motivations become clear. The erasure begins to make sense. But first, you need to see what was erased. You need to understand what actually existed in those centuries, what kind of power was wielded, and why that power became so threatening that later generations needed to pretend it barely existed at all. The Merovingian Dynasty ruled for 300 years. They were there before France. So why does saying their name feel like speaking a forbidden word? Most people have never encountered this word outside 2 contexts. The first is obscure academic papers that historians write for other historians, buried in university libraries, where the general public never ventures. The second is stranger, the Matrix movies, where a character named the Merovingian appears as an ancient, powerful program who survived multiple iterations of the system. The filmmakers chose that name deliberately. They understood that something about the Merovingians suggested age, hidden power, and secrets that survived when they shouldn't have. But the Merovingians were real. They weren't programs or legends. They were flesh and blood rulers who unified the Frankish tribes after Rome's collapse and built something that looked remarkably like an empire. They minted coins bearing their images. They commanded armies that fought wars across Europe. They built churches that still stand today. They established laws and collected taxes. Their authority was recognized from the Atlantic Ocean to the edges of Byzantine territory. These weren't tribal chieftains huddling in ruins. These were kings who operated with the infrastructure and legitimacy of an organized state. So, here's the question that should trouble anyone who studies history. Why is Charlemagne taught in every middle school, his empire analyzed in every introductory history course, while the dynasty he overthrew remains a mystery even to educated adults? Charlemagne didn't create medieval Europe from nothing. He seized control of something that already existed. He toppled a dynasty that had been ruling for generations. Yet history books present him as a founder rather than a conqueror. When historians do mention the Merovingians, they use peculiar language. They describe the period as obscure, despite thousands of surviving documents. They call the evidence fragmentary, when archaeological sites throughout France and Germany preserve Merovingian artifacts. They write about limited sources while ignoring chronicles, letters, and legal documents that paint a detailed picture of this civilization. The choice of words creates an impression. This era is unknowable, unreliable, not worth your attention. But unknowable to whom? Not to archaeologists who excavate Merovingian sites and find sophisticated metalwork, organized cemeteries, and planned urban centers. Not to numismatists who study Merovingian coins and trace complex trade networks. Not to scholars who read the Latin chronicles written during this period and discover detailed accounts of political intrigue, military campaigns, and cultural achievements. The evidence exists. It's been there the entire time. What doesn't exist is the popular awareness. This is how historical erasure actually works. You don't burn every document and demolish every building. That's too obvious. Instead, you change the lighting. You adjust what gets emphasized in textbooks and what gets relegated to specialist journals. You present certain eras as central to the narrative and others as peripheral curiosities. Over generations, the pattern becomes invisible. People don't realize they're being shown a selective version of the past because the selection happened centuries ago. The Merovingians themselves claimed something extraordinary about their origins. They traced their lineage to a source so unusual, so controversial, that medieval chroniclers recorded the claim with obvious discomfort. Later dynasties found this claim problematic enough that they needed to distance themselves completely from Merovingian legitimacy. Understanding what the Merovingians believed about themselves and what others believed about them may explain why their memory had to be suppressed rather than simply forgotten. To understand why they were erased, we must first understand who they really were. We need to reconstruct the empire that textbooks won't show you. We need to see the Merovingian world as it actually existed, in all its complexity and power. History isn't what happened. History is what someone decided to write down, and more importantly, what someone decided to leave out. Over the course of this investigation, we're going to uncover several things that should have been taught alongside Caesar and Charlemagne but weren't. We're going to see the true extent of Merovingian power, not through vague historian summaries, but through physical evidence that still exists in the ground. We'll examine the sacred mystery at the heart of their legitimacy, the claim that made them both revered and dangerous. We'll walk through archaeological sites that prove their sophistication was far beyond what we've been told. And most crucially, we'll understand why their memory was systematically suppressed by the dynasties that followed. But this isn't a treasure hunt through wild conspiracy theories. This is about something more fundamental, understanding the difference between official history and material history. Official history is what gets written by victors, what gets emphasized in textbooks, what becomes common knowledge. Material history is what archaeology reveals, what physical evidence tells us, what survives in the ground despite efforts to rewrite the narrative above it. When those two versions of history don't align, you're looking at a gap that tells its own story. Throughout this journey, we'll return to a central theme, the role of power in shaping what we remember. The Catholic Church didn't just influence medieval Europe spiritually, it controlled the writing of history itself. Monasteries were the publishers of their age. Monks copied manuscripts, and in that copying, they made choices about what deserved preservation and what could be allowed to fade. When later dynasties needed legitimacy, they needed the Church's blessing, and that blessing often came with a price, the rewriting of inconvenient truths about the past. This is where political motivation enters the story. Charlemagne needed to present himself as a founder, not a usurper. The Carolingian dynasty that followed him needed to justify why they replaced the Merovingians rather than descended from them. The Capetian kings who came later needed to distance themselves from both previous dynasties. Each new power structure had reasons to minimize what came before. Over centuries, those minimizations compounded. The Merovingians weren't destroyed in a single purge. They were diminished gradually, faded deliberately, until they became a name that even educated people don't recognize. But here's what makes this story worth investigating. The Dark Ages were only dark because someone turned off the lights deliberately. The Merovingian period wasn't a void in European history. It was a foundation. Everything that came after, from medieval kingship to the relationship between church and state, from the concept of divine right to the structure of European territories, was built on Merovingian precedents. When you erase the foundation, the building above looks like it's floating on nothing. That's the illusion we've inherited. You're about to see medieval Europe through completely different eyes. You'll understand that the chaos historians describe was actually transition. The fragmentary evidence was actually abundant but ignored. The obscure period was actually well documented, but not widely taught. You'll see how a dynasty that ruled for 3 centuries became a footnote in the very territories it created. This isn't about proving conspiracies. This is about recognizing patterns in how history gets written and rewritten. It's about understanding that every history book you've ever read made choices about what to include and what to minimize. And when you see those choices clearly, when you understand who made them and why, you start to see history as something more complex than a simple timeline of events. The Merovingians existed, they mattered, and someone decided you shouldn't know how much. While history books show you the Byzantine Empire's glory, they hide the fact that an equally sophisticated civilization existed just beyond the Alps. The evidence is still there, the cities still stand, but the map has been erased. Picture Europe around the year 600. In your mind, you probably see Byzantium Constantinople's golden domes, its libraries and forums, its emperor ruling from a throne that claimed continuity with Rome itself. You might imagine the emerging Islamic world, already beginning to reshape the Mediterranean. Perhaps you see Tang Dynasty, China, building the foundations of a civilization that would dominate Asia for centuries. These are the powers that history books illuminate when they discuss the 6th century. But there's another realm on that map, one that textbooks glance past so quickly you barely register its existence. It stretches from the Atlantic coast to the Rhine River, from the North Sea down through what is now France, across the Pyrenees into northern Spain, eastward to the Alps and Mediterranean. This is Francia, the Merovingian heartland, and in the year 600, it's not a collection of mud huts and wandering tribes. It's an empire. Walk through this world as it actually existed. Mediterranean merchants dock at ports along the southern coast, unloading olive oil and spices, taking on wool and metalwork. Those Roman roads everyone assumes fell into ruin? They're still carrying traffic, still connecting cities, still maintained well enough that armies and trade caravans use them regularly. The difference is that now Germanic warriors ride alongside Roman merchants, their cultures mixing in ways that create something genuinely new. The cities haven't collapsed. Paris rises on its island in the Seine, stone buildings, clustering around churches where bishops wield both spiritual and political power. Reims spreads across fertile plains, its workshops producing textiles that reach markets in Italy and Spain. Tours guards the western approaches, its monastery library preserving manuscripts, while the surrounding countryside produces enough surplus grain to feed a genuine urban population. These aren't settlements. These are functioning urban centers with markets, governance, and cultural production. In the royal palaces, Merovingian kings hold court with protocols that would look familiar to any Byzantine diplomat. They dispense justice according to written laws. They collect taxes. They mint coins stamped with their images and titles. They appoint bishops and counts to administer territories. They command armies that fight organized campaigns rather than random raids. The infrastructure of government exists and functions. This creates a profound cognitive dissonance. Students learn about Byzantium as the sophisticated heir to Rome, which it was. They learn about the Islamic Caliphate as a civilization of learning and culture, which it was. They learn about Tang China as an era of unprecedented achievement, which it was. But the Merovingian realm, contemporary with all of them, existing in the same time frame, engaging in diplomacy and trade with these very civilizations, that realm is presented as primitive, chaotic, barely worthy of attention. Why? The answer lies not in the 6th century, but in the centuries of French historians who came after. They needed France's true beginning to be Charlemagne. They needed the Carolingian Renaissance to appear as a sudden flowering of civilization after centuries of darkness. If they acknowledged that the Merovingians had already built a functioning empire, already established the territories and institutions that became medieval France, then Charlemagne becomes less impressive. He becomes a conqueror who seized something that already existed, rather than a visionary who created something from nothing. So the Merovingian realm was written down, not erased entirely, that would be too obvious, just minimized, made to seem transitional, temporary, not worthy of serious study. The sophisticated urban centers became remnants of Roman civilization gradually decaying. The international trade became occasional commerce. The organized government became weak kings controlled by strong nobles. Every achievement was qualified, diminished, explained away. But the physical evidence doesn't cooperate with this narrative. The cities that Merovingian kings built still anchor modern France. The roads they maintained still define transportation routes. The churches they founded still serve congregations. The grave goods archaeologists excavate from Merovingian tombs reveal wealth and sophistication that contradicts the primitive barbarism that historians describe. To truly understand Merovingian Francia, we must understand the people who built it. And more specifically, we must understand the extraordinary claim they made about their origins, because that claim might explain everything that came after. Beneath the cathedrals that tourists visit today in Paris and Reims lie foundations of older churches, churches that weren't supposed to be that sophisticated, churches that told the wrong story. Let's walk through 3 cities that reveal what Merovingian civilization actually looked like, not through historians' descriptions, but through archaeological reality, the stones and streets and buildings that survived despite centuries of attempts to rewrite their story. Paris, in the 6th century, isn't the muddy medieval village you might imagine. The city rises on the Ile de la Cité, that island in the Seine that still forms Paris's heart today. Stone buildings line streets that follow Roman planning. The aqueducts that brought water to the city during Rome's rule, still functioning, still bringing clean water to fountains and baths. The Merovingian kings used Paris as one of their principal residences, holding court in a palace complex that archaeologists would later discover beneath layers of later construction. When they excavated those layers, they found something unexpected: sophisticated architecture, decorative stonework, evidence of a building program that suggested wealth and planning rather than decay and chaos. Reims tells an even more striking story. This is where Merovingian kings are crowned, where the dynasty's legitimacy is ritually confirmed. The cathedral that stands there during the Merovingian period seats hundreds of people. Its walls bear frescoes. Its treasury holds vessels of gold and silver. When Clovis, the first Christian Merovingian king, is baptized here around 496, the ceremony involves the kind of elaborate ritual that requires infrastructure, organization, and cultural sophistication. Yet, standard histories treat this event as if it happened in a crude stone church in a barbaric backwater. The archaeological evidence says otherwise. Then there's Metz, the eastern stronghold of Merovingian power. This city becomes a manufacturing center, its workshops producing metalwork that rivals anything created in Byzantium. Archaeologists have found evidence of organized craft production, not scattered artisans working individually, but workshops with multiple craftsmen, standardized techniques, trade connections that brought raw materials from across Europe. The manuscripts produced in Metz's scriptoria show artistic sophistication that contradicts the notion of a society barely clinging to literacy. These aren't crude copies of Roman texts. These are illuminated manuscripts with original artistic styles, evidence of a living culture producing new work rather than merely preserving old. But here's where the pattern of erasure becomes visible. When the Carolingians come to power, they rebuild. Charlemagne and his successors construct new churches, new palaces, new administrative buildings. This sounds like normal urban development until you examine what they're building over. Modern excavations beneath Carolingian-era churches consistently find Merovingian structures underneath. And these Merovingian buildings aren't primitive wooden halls. They're stone churches with foundations, with architectural planning, with decorative elements. The Carolingians didn't simply renovate these buildings. They demolished them and built over them, incorporating some elements but obscuring the original construction in ways that made it impossible for later observers to recognize Merovingian sophistication. This wasn't accidental. This was architectural erasure, as deliberate as rewriting a history book. By destroying and rebuilding, later dynasties could claim they brought civilization to cities that, according to the physical evidence, were already civilized. The graves tell their own story. Merovingian burial customs included placing elaborate goods with the dead weapons, jewelry, tools, coins. When archaeologists excavate these graves, they find evidence of international trade networks. A sword forged using techniques from Scandinavia, jewelry with garnets from India, coins from Byzantium, glass vessels from Syria. These aren't the grave goods of isolated barbarians scraping by in Roman ruins. These are the treasures of a society wealthy enough to acquire luxury items from 3 continents. Yet walk into most museums today, and the Merovingian sections are small, poorly lit, tucked away in corners. The artifacts are there, but they're presented without context, without emphasis. The Byzantine collections get entire galleries. The Roman collections sprawl across multiple rooms. The Merovingian evidence gets a display case and a placard explaining that this was a transitional period before the real medieval era began. The cities remain. The foundations are still in the ground. The artifacts sit in museum storage. The evidence hasn't disappeared. But the story that explains what this evidence means, the story of a sophisticated empire that thrived for 3 centuries, that story was buried as deliberately as those Merovingian churches beneath later construction. These physical remains pose a question that historians have never adequately answered. If the Merovingians built cities this sophisticated and left behind such wealth, who exactly were they? They exchanged letters with emperors. They minted coins that traveled to 3 continents. They negotiated treaties that shaped Europe. So why were they written off as lazy barbarians? The diplomatic reach of Merovingian Francia reveals an empire that operated on the international stage with sophistication that contradicts everything we're taught about this era. Letters survive in Byzantine archives, where emperors address Merovingian kings using the formal protocols reserved for legitimate rulers, not as tribal chieftains, not as barbarian warlords who might be useful allies, as fellow monarchs, as powers to be respected and negotiated with as equals. These weren't occasional exchanges. This was ongoing diplomacy. Merovingian courts received embassies from Constantinople regularly. Treaties were negotiated, trade agreements established, military alliances formed. When Byzantium faced threats in Italy or the Balkans, Byzantine emperors sought Merovingian support. When Merovingian kings needed legitimacy for their rule, Byzantine recognition provided it. This was the normal traffic of international relations between 2 sophisticated states. The connections spread beyond Byzantium. Diplomatic marriages linked Merovingian royalty to Visigothic Spain. These weren't simple tribal exchanges of daughters to seal temporary alliances. These were calculated political marriages with elaborate negotiations over dowries, territories, and succession rights. Letters discussing these arrangements reveal courtiers arguing over legal precedents, citing previous treaties, negotiating with the kind of detail that requires bureaucracy and institutional memory. Trade networks tell the same story. Merovingian coins appear in excavations from Ireland to Constantinople. This wasn't random distribution. This was systematic commerce, with Merovingian currency accepted across known trade routes because it held recognized value. Merchants trusted that a coin minted in Metz or Paris would be honored in distant markets. That trust doesn't emerge in chaotic, unstable societies. It emerges in places where authority is reliable enough to maintain currency standards over time and distance. Even more striking are the connections with the Islamic world. As the Caliphate expands across North Africa and into Spain in the late Merovingian period, diplomatic contact occurs. Letters are exchanged. Trade continues through new channels. The Merovingian realm doesn't collapse in isolation. It remains engaged with the emerging powers of the 7th century, negotiating and adapting as the Mediterranean political landscape shifts. So how does a dynasty this connected, this diplomatically sophisticated, this engaged with the major powers of its era, simply vanish from historical consciousness? How does an empire that exchanged embassies with Byzantium, negotiated treaties with Visigoths, and maintained trade networks across 3 continents get reduced to a historical footnote about barbarian chaos? The answer lies in retroactive simplification. When Carolingian historians wrote about the Merovingian period, they were writing under the patronage of the dynasty that had overthrown the Merovingians. Every sentence they wrote had to justify that overthrow. This meant the Merovingians couldn't be portrayed as competent rulers who were simply defeated. They had to be portrayed as degenerate, weak, and incapable rulers whose displacement was not just politically convenient, but morally necessary. Watch how the simplification works in the chronicles. Every diplomatic achievement gets attributed to wise advisors rather than Merovingian kings themselves. The kings are described as figureheads, while their mayors of the palace Carolingian ancestors supposedly did the real governing. Every military victory becomes barbarian luck rather than strategic planning. Every treaty becomes evidence of Merovingian weakness rather than diplomatic skill. Every cultural achievement gets credited to surviving Roman traditions rather than contemporary Merovingian patronage. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. This is systematic rewriting, the kind that happens when a new regime needs to legitimize itself by delegitimizing its predecessors. Compare it to how revolutionary governments rewrite their country's history. The previous regime must be portrayed as corrupt and incompetent to justify the revolution. The Carolingians needed the Merovingians to seem weak and degenerate to justify their seizure of power. So that's the version that entered the historical record and stayed there for over 1,000 years. Modern historians who rely on Carolingian-era chronicles inherit this bias without questioning it. They read about do-nothing kings and accept it as fact, rather than recognizing it as propaganda. They describe the Merovingian period as chaotic because Carolingian sources said it was chaotic, without asking whether those sources had reasons to lie. We've established what the Merovingians built: cities, trade networks, diplomatic relationships, infrastructure of empire. Now we must ask who they were, and more importantly, who they claimed to be. Because that claim, that extraordinary assertion about their origins, might explain why later dynasties found them so threatening that simple defeat wasn't enough. They had to be erased. They claimed their ancestor was fathered by a creature from the sea, and the church, reluctantly, accepted it, because the alternative was worse. Every dynasty needs a foundation story, a narrative that explains why they rule and others don't. Roman emperors traced their lineage to gods and heroes. Chinese dynasties claimed the mandate of heaven. European kings would later insist on divine right bestowed through Christian coronation. But the Merovingians claimed something stranger, something that made even their contemporaries uncomfortable. The story appears in the Chronicles of Gregory of Tours, written in the late 6th century when the dynasty was at its height. He describes Merovech, the founder whose name the dynasty bears, as the product of an impossible union. His mother, already married to the Frankish king Clodio, was swimming in the ocean when she encountered something. Gregory's Latin is deliberately vague, using terms that could mean sea monster, divine beast, or something with no proper name in human language. She emerged pregnant. The child was Merovech, and from Merovech came all the Merovingian kings. This wasn't whispered gossip or enemy propaganda. This was official dynastic mythology, recorded by a bishop who served Merovingian kings and had every reason to present them favorably. The Merovingians wanted this story told. They wanted people to know their blood came from something other than human. Understanding why requires understanding the political landscape they navigated. In the post-Roman world, legitimacy came from two sources. Imperial legitimacy flowed from Rome, from the claim to continue Roman authority. Religious legitimacy flowed from the church, from bishops and popes who could crown kings and bless their rule. But the Merovingians were neither Roman nor initially Christian. They were Frankish warriors who had conquered Roman territory. They needed a third source of authority, something that predated both Rome and the church, something that made their right to rule inherent rather than granted. So they claimed sacred blood. Not sacred because the church blessed it, but sacred because it contained something divine from before Christianity itself. This was politically brilliant and theologically dangerous. It meant their authority couldn't be revoked by any earthly power, not even the Pope. It meant their kingship was magical, inherent, a property of their bodies rather than a title that could be given or taken away. Contemporaries took this seriously. The long hair that Merovingian kings wore wasn't a fashion choice, it was proof of their supernatural bloodline. Their inability to be deposed, even when they became powerless figureheads, stemmed from the belief that their blood was literally too sacred to spill. Even enemies who conquered Merovingian territories didn't kill the kings. They sent them to monasteries, cut their hair, removed them from power, but they didn't execute them. That would be sacrilege. The church tolerated this uncomfortable mythology because the alternative was worse. If the Merovingians couldn't claim sacred bloodline, they might have claimed divine appointment through some source other than Christian bishops. They might have maintained their pagan Frankish kingship traditions without even the veneer of Christianity. By allowing the Merovingians to Christianize their origin myth, the sea creature became a mystery of God's providence. Their sacred blood became a divine blessing. The church brought them partially under ecclesiastical control, partially, but never fully. This created tensions that simmered throughout the dynasty's existence. Letters survive from bishops questioning the Merovingians' peculiar notions of kingship. Popes wrote carefully worded documents that acknowledged Merovingian authority while trying to establish that proper consecration required church participation. The Merovingians agreed to Christian coronation ceremonies, but never abandoned the claim that their right to rule existed independently of those ceremonies. Later dynasties found this intolerable. The Carolingians, when they eventually seized power, needed kingship to flow from church consecration, from papal approval, from sources they could control. A sacred bloodline that made authority inherent and unchallengeable was a threat to that model. The Merovingians had to be removed from power. But more than that, their entire concept of sacred kingship had to be discredited. The sacred bloodline claim had practical consequences. It determined who could rule and who couldn't, creating political tensions that would eventually tear the dynasty apart from within. Their hair wasn't just hair, it was proof of divinity. Which is why, when they wanted to end a king, they didn't execute him, they sheared him. In an era when Roman military tradition favored short, practical hair, and Germanic warrior culture often involved warriors cutting their hair before battle or shaving it in specific patterns to mark clan membership, the Merovingian kings stood apart. Their hair flowed long, uncut from birth to death, cascading down their backs in a visual declaration of difference. This wasn't vanity, this was theology made visible. The hair embodied their sacred power. Contemporary sources describe it in language usually reserved for holy relics. It was untouchable, inviolable, a physical manifestation of the supernatural bloodline that gave them authority. To see a Merovingian king was to see his hair first, a living symbol that separated him from every other person in the kingdom, noble or common, bishop or warrior. This created a peculiar political weapon. When enemies wanted to remove a Merovingian prince from the line of succession without killing him, which remained taboo because of his sacred blood, they cut his hair. The sources record specific incidents with striking consistency. In 511, after King Clovis died, one of his sons had rivals' children tonsured to disqualify them from royal power. In 585, the pretender Gundovald was exposed as a fraud, partly because questions arose about whether he'd maintained proper royal hair. Throughout the dynasty's history, forcible hair cutting appears repeatedly as the ultimate political humiliation, the destruction of royal legitimacy without bloodshed. But it worked both ways. Letting the hair grow back could restore legitimacy. Some princes who were tonsured and sent to monasteries later escaped, grew their hair long again, and reclaimed royal titles. The hair wasn't just a symbol, it was the mechanism of power itself. As long as a Merovingian had his hair, he remained dangerous to whoever currently held power. This is why deposed kings were carefully guarded after being sheared. The hair could return, the claim could be renewed. This created profound discomfort for the Catholic Church. Bishops and popes were trying to establish a model of kingship where authority flowed from consecration, from ecclesiastical blessing, from the Church's power to make and unmake rulers through anointing and excommunication. The Merovingians represented something older and more threatening, a kingship that existed independently of Christian approval, that drew its legitimacy from pre-Christian magical thinking, barely disguised with Christian language. The Church couldn't openly oppose this. The Merovingians were too powerful, too necessary, as protectors of Christianity in formerly pagan territories. But letters and church records reveal the tension. Bishops carefully avoided endorsing the hair's sacred properties, while also never quite denying them. They emphasized baptism and consecration, while quietly accepting that Merovingian authority seemed to function through different mechanisms. The compromise was unstable, and everyone knew it. What the hair revealed was the fundamental nature of Merovingian kingship. It was conceived as magical rather than political. A Merovingian didn't become king through election, military victory, or divine appointment in the Christian sense. He was king because he was born king, because his blood carried properties that made rule his natural state. The hair was simply the outward proof of that inner reality. This made them simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. Powerful because their claim to rule couldn't be challenged through normal political means. You couldn't out-argue or outmaneuver a sacred bloodline. Vulnerable because their authority was entirely passive. They didn't need to earn loyalty or maintain competence. they simply were. This passivity would eventually allow power to drain away from them while they remained on their thrones, too sacred to remove but too passive to actually govern. When the Carolingians finally overthrew the last Merovingian king in 751, they understood the symbolism perfectly. Childeric III was deposed, his hair was cut, and he was sent to a monastery. Only after that ritual destruction of his sacred power was it safe to declare the dynasty ended. The hair had to be cut first. Everything else followed from that single act. While Merovingian kings claimed sacred blood that manifested in their hair, the actual exercise of power in Francia was far more complicated and far more brutal than mystical imagery suggests. They were too sacred to be removed from power. So instead, power simply moved around them, leaving them as living ghosts on thrones they no longer controlled. The Merovingian royal family's history reads like a catalogue of horrors. Brothers murdering brothers for territory, queens ordering the assassination of rival queens' children, uncles eliminating nephews, cousins meeting in armed conflict, entire branches of the family tree cut short by poison, blade, or strangling. The chronicles record this violence with numbing regularity, incident after incident of familial slaughter that modern readers find almost incomprehensible in its brutality. But this wasn't barbarism. This was system. And understanding that system explains both the dynasty's longevity and its eventual collapse. Merovingian inheritance law contained a fatal flaw built into its very foundation. When a king died, his realm wasn't inherited by the eldest son. It was divided among all legitimate male heirs. This meant Francia constantly fractured into smaller kingdoms, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, occasionally 4 separate realms, each ruled by a brother or cousin, each technically independent but all still Merovingian. These divided kingdoms then fought to reunify under one ruler, only to divide again at the next generation's succession. The cycle repeated endlessly. This created constant warfare, but not chaotic warfare. It was systematic, predictable, almost ritualized. Royal brothers knew they would fight each other for territory. Royal mothers knew they needed to secure their sons' positions through any means necessary, including eliminating rival claimants. The violence followed patterns, operated according to its own brutal logic. In a twisted way, it worked. The system had an unexpected benefit. It prevented permanent tyranny. No single line could dominate forever because inheritance laws constantly redistributed power. And it prevented external conquest because only Merovingians could rule. The sacred bloodline restriction meant no foreign dynasty or ambitious general could seize the throne without marrying into the family. The very thing that made succession so violent also made it stable in its own perverse fashion. But this system created a vacuum that other families began to fill. The constant warfare required military commanders. The divided kingdoms needed administrators. The sacred kings required advisors to handle the practical business of governance. These roles fell to the great noble families of Francia, and one position became particularly crucial: the mayor of the palace. The mayor wasn't a ceremonial position. He was the chief administrator, the head of the royal household, the coordinator of military campaigns. As Merovingian kings spent their energy fighting each other over territory and succession, the mayors increasingly handled everything else. They commanded armies, collected taxes, appointed officials, negotiated treaties. The kings remained on their thrones, their sacred hair uncut, their bloodline unchallenged. But power drained away from them, like water seeping through sand. The supreme irony was that the bloodline mystique that made Merovingians unkillable also made them powerless. Their authority was inherent rather than earned. They didn't have to maintain political networks, demonstrate military competence, or build loyalty. They simply were kings, by virtue of birth. This meant they never developed the skills necessary to actually wield power. Why would they? Their right to rule was guaranteed by blood, manifested in hair, secured by sacred mystery that no political maneuvering could challenge. So when competent, ambitious families, particularly the Carolingian family that held the mayor position for generations, accumulated real power, the Merovingians couldn't respond effectively. They couldn't rally armies because the mayors commanded military loyalty. They couldn't build political alliances because nobles looked to the mayors for advancement. They couldn't even threaten violence because everyone understood that sacred blood made Merovingians untouchable, which meant they had no credible way to enforce their will. By the early 8th century, Merovingian kings had become exactly what later Carolingian propaganda claimed they were: do-nothing kings. powerless figureheads who sat on thrones while others governed in their name. But this wasn't because they were inherently lazy or degenerate. It was the inevitable result of a political system that made their authority magical rather than practical, sacred rather than earned. They remained on those thrones for decades after real power had departed, living symbols of a kingship model that no longer functioned. Too sacred to remove but too passive to govern, they existed in a strange political limbo, still technically rulers, but functionally irrelevant. As Merovingian kings became ceremonial figures, real power concentrated in the hands of a single family. A family that had served the dynasty for generations but was now ready to claim the throne for themselves. The question wasn't if the Merovingians would be overthrown, but how it could be done without violating the sacred bloodline that had protected them for 300 years. For 50 years, everyone knew the real king, but no one could say it out loud, because blood was still sacred, until it wasn't. The position started simply enough. Mayor of the palace, major domus in Latin, the chief administrator of the royal household, the person who managed the practical details of court life while the king focused on ruling. It was a servant's role, prestigious but subordinate. That's what it was supposed to be. But power has a way of flowing to whoever actually exercises it. And by the late 7th century, the Merovingian kings had stopped exercising much of anything. One family saw the opening. The Arnulfings, later known as the Carolingians, held the mayor position across multiple generations. Each generation consolidated more authority, moved more carefully, accumulated more real power, while maintaining absolute public deference to the sacred bloodline on the throne. They were patient. They understood that sacred kingship couldn't be overthrown by force, it had to be made irrelevant first. Pepin of Herstal was the first to operate essentially as king without the title. He commanded armies, distributed lands, appointed bishops, collected revenues. When nobles needed justice or favour, they came to him, not to the Merovingian king sitting in his palace with his long hair untouched. Pepin maintained the forms carefully. He always acted in the Merovingian king's name, always positioned himself as a loyal servant. But everyone understood the reality. His son Charles went further. History knows him as Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, for his military prowess. In 732, he fought one of medieval Europe's most celebrated battles at Tours, stopping a Muslim army advancing north from Spain. The battle is taught in every history class as the moment Christian Europe was saved from Islamic conquest. Students learn Charles Martel's name, memorize the date, understand the stakes. What they don't learn is the uncomfortable detail. No Merovingian king was present at Tours. Charles fought under his own authority, distributed the captured spoils as he saw fit, made decisions about war and peace without consulting the dynasty he supposedly served. He was ruling in everything but name, and everyone knew it. Yet the Merovingian king remained on his throne, his hair long, his blood sacred, his actual power non-existent. Charles's son, Pepin the Short, inherited this impossible situation. He commanded absolute loyalty from the Frankish nobility. He controlled the military. He administered justice. He negotiated with foreign powers. But he couldn't call himself king because he lacked the one thing that mattered, the sacred Merovingian bloodline. His blood was noble but ordinary. His hair could be cut. His authority, however practical and effective, was technically borrowed from the powerless figureheads he served. This created a stalemate that lasted decades. The Carolingians had everything except legitimacy. The Merovingians had nothing except legitimacy. And that legitimacy still mattered because 300 years of dynastic mythology couldn't simply be wished away. Francia had been taught that legitimate rule flowed from sacred blood, that Merovingian hair manifested divine right, that kingship was inherent rather than earned. You couldn't just dismiss that with force. So the Carolingians began building an alternative narrative of legitimacy, not based on mystical bloodline, but on accomplishment. Look at what we've achieved, the narrative suggested. Look at the battles we've won, the order we've maintained, the enemies we've defeated. Look at how we actually govern while they simply exist. Doesn't that count for more than ancient claims about sea monsters and sacred hair? But they needed more than their own assertions. They needed validation from a source that could rival or exceed the mystical authority of bloodline kingship. They needed someone who could declare that sacred blood no longer mattered, that a new principle of legitimacy had superseded the old one. They needed the church. For decades, the Carolingians cultivated relationships with bishops, made themselves indispensable to ecclesiastical interests, presented themselves as Christianity's most effective defenders. They built the groundwork for what would become one of medieval history's most consequential political negotiations, a deal that would end the Merovingian dynasty and create a new model of European kingship that would last 1,000 years. If sacred blood couldn't be overcome by military force or political skill, how did the Carolingians finally take the throne? The answer lies in an alliance with the only power greater than mystical bloodline. The Pope didn't just make a new king, he invented a new type of kingship. And in doing so, he erased the old one from history. The year is 751. Pepin the Short faces a problem that military victories can't solve. He rules Francia in every practical sense, but he can't call himself king. The Merovingian bloodline still sits on the throne, powerless but present, figureheads but legitimate. And legitimacy, even empty legitimacy, still constrains what Pepin can openly claim. So he sends a carefully worded question to Rome, not a request or a demand, but a philosophical inquiry posed to Pope Zacharias. Who should properly be called king? The man who holds the title, or the man who holds the power? The question is brilliant in its simplicity. It doesn't attack Merovingian sacred bloodline directly. It doesn't question 300 years of dynastic mythology. It simply asks the Pope to choose between empty legitimacy and effective governance. And it does this in a way that makes the Pope's answer seem like a matter of principle rather than political calculation. Pope Zacharias answers that the man with power should be king. With that response, everything changes. Pepin has what he needed: ecclesiastical permission to do what everyone already knew was reality. He deposes the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, in a ceremony that carefully follows ritual requirements. Childeric's hair is cut, destroying his sacred power. He's sent to a monastery, removed from political life, but kept alive the compromise between old taboos about killing sacred blood and new realities about who actually rules. Pepin then undergoes consecration by bishops, receiving anointing and ecclesiastical blessing. He's crowned king not because of his bloodline, but because the church says he's king. This looks like a simple power transfer. It was actually a revolution in political theology. The Pope didn't give this permission out of principle or theological conviction. He gave it because he needed something Pepin could provide. In Italy, the Lombards were advancing on papal territory, threatening Rome itself. The Byzantine Empire, which theoretically protected the Pope, was too distant, too weak, or too uninterested to help. Pope Zacharias needed military protection. Pepin offered a deal: papal legitimization in exchange for military intervention in Italy. Both sides got what they wanted. Both sides changed Europe in the process. What Pepin received was more valuable than military alliance. He received a new model of kingship that would define European politics for the next 1,000 years. Kings would no longer rule by inherent blood right or mystical inheritance. They would rule by ecclesiastical consecration. The church could make kings through coronation and anointing. And if the church could make kings, the church could unmake them through excommunication and withdrawal of support. This was revolutionary because it replaced the Merovingian model of authority inherent, magical, outside church control with a model where the church was essential to legitimacy. Kings now ruled by divine right, but that right was mediated through ecclesiastical ceremony. No consecration, no legitimacy. The Pope became the ultimate arbiter of who could and couldn't claim royal authority. But this also explains something crucial about how history was written afterward. Later historians, working under church patronage or writing in a cultural framework where ecclesiastical authority was assumed, had every reason to minimize the Merovingians. The Merovingian model of kingship, sacred blood, inherent authority, power outside church control, was a threat to the entire system that replaced it. If people remembered that legitimate kings could exist without church blessing, that authority could flow from sources the church didn't control, then the foundation of medieval political theology became questionable. So the Merovingians had to be portrayed not just as defeated, but as illegitimate from the start. Their sacred bloodline claims had to seem like barbaric superstition. Their long hair had to seem like primitive affectation. Their entire dynasty had to appear as a regrettable but temporary deviation from proper Christian kingship. The church that once reluctantly acknowledged their authority became the institution that ensured later generations would barely remember they existed. Replacing a dynasty wasn't enough. The Carolingians needed to replace the memory of the dynasty, to rewrite history itself so that their coup appeared inevitable, even righteous. They didn't burn the books. They rewrote them. And then they copied those rewritten versions so many times that the originals disappeared. History became what they said it was. After Pepin the Short seized the throne, his son Charlemagne understood that military conquest wasn't enough. You had to conquer memory itself. You had to control what people believed about the past, so they would accept the present you were creating. Charlemagne's court became the center of what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a flowering of learning, literature, and manuscript production. Monasteries throughout the kingdom received patronage to copy classical texts, create new chronicles, and standardize the written record of Francia's history. This sounds like cultural preservation. It was actually historical revision. The chronicles produced under Carolingian patronage tell a consistent story about the late Merovingian period. The kings are portrayed as rois fainéants, lazy kings, do-nothing kings, degenerate rulers who had lost all capacity for governance. They're described lounging in palaces, while competent mayors of the palace did the real work. They're depicted as physically weak, mentally inadequate, interested only in luxury while their kingdom crumbled around them. The message is clear. The Carolingian takeover wasn't a coup, but a rescue. The removal of incompetent rulers by capable administrators who reluctantly accepted the burden of kingship. But notice how the narrative is constructed. The Carolingians don't deny that Merovingian kings existed or that they once held real power. Instead, they create a story of gradual degeneration. The early Merovingians, Clovis and his immediate successors, are portrayed with some respect. They unified Francia, converted to Christianity, established the kingdom. But then, the chronicles claim, something went wrong. Later generations became progressively weaker, more corrupt, more incompetent, until by the 8th century they were barely functional. This is sophisticated propaganda because it's partially true. The late Merovingian kings were figureheads. They had lost effective power to the mayors of the palace. But the chronicles never explain why this happened, never acknowledge that the Carolingians themselves systematically stripped power from Merovingian kings over several generations. Instead, the loss of power is attributed to Merovingian weakness, as if it were an internal decay rather than an external usurpation. Real administrative documents from the Merovingian period were recopied during the Carolingian era. In that copying, subtle changes occurred. Merovingian achievements were downplayed. Successes were attributed to wise advisors rather than royal initiative. Unflattering anecdotes, some real, some embellished, some possibly invented, were amplified. The Merovingian era was reframed as transitional, a necessary but regrettable gap between Roman civilization and Carolingian renewal. Here's what makes this so effective. Because almost all surviving manuscripts of early medieval texts were copied in Carolingian scriptoria, we see the Merovingian period through Carolingian eyes. The original documents, written during the Merovingian era itself, mostly didn't survive. What survived were copies made by scribes working for the dynasty that had overthrown the Merovingians. It would be like trying to understand a revolution using only documents approved by the revolutionary government. The Carolingians understood something fundamental about power. Controlling the present requires controlling the past. If they could make people believe the Merovingians were always weak, always degenerate, always incompetent, then their overthrow seemed justified. If they could make the Merovingian period seem like a dark age that Charlemagne illuminated, then Carolingian rule seemed like salvation rather than usurpation. And it worked. For over 1,000 years, historians accepted the Carolingian narrative with minimal question. The Merovingians were taught, when they were taught at all, as the Carolingians portrayed them. Weak kings, whose main historical function was to exist until someone better came along. But if the Carolingians controlled the written record so completely, how can we know any truth about the Merovingians? The answer lies in evidence the Carolingians couldn't control or didn't think to destroy. Fragments, margins, palimpsests. Evidence survives in the least unlikely places, and it tells a different story than the one they wanted told. Consider Byzantium. Between the 5th and 8th centuries, the Byzantine Empire produced thousands of surviving documents. Administrative records, tracking tax collection, military rosters, diplomatic correspondence, legal proceedings, theological debates, literary works, historical chronicles. The archives are vast. Historians can reconstruct Byzantine government in remarkable detail because the paperwork survived. Now consider Merovingian Francia. Comparable population, comparable territory, a society that minted standardized coinage, maintained organized military campaigns, conducted international diplomacy, collected taxes, and administered justice according to written legal codes. All of this requires extensive documentation. Letters must be written, treaties must be recorded, tax registers must be maintained, legal judgments must be documented, court proceedings must be chronicled. So where is it? A handful of chronicles, some hagiographies of saints, a few legal documents, some letters from bishops. The surviving Merovingian written record is so sparse that you can read almost all of it in a few weeks of dedicated study. This is presented as normal, as simply what happens during the Dark Ages. Documents get lost, libraries burn, knowledge fades. But archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations of Merovingian sites reveal a literate society. Writing implements appear in graves. Stone inscriptions mark buildings and tombs. References in later texts mention Merovingian documents that no longer exist. The infrastructure of literacy was there. The documents were created. They just didn't survive. This wasn't random loss. This was selective preservation. Medieval manuscript survival depended on one thing: whether monasteries and scriptoria chose to copy texts. Parchment was expensive. Labor was costly. Copying a manuscript required weeks of work by skilled scribes. So institutions made choices about what deserved preservation. Under Carolingian rule, those institutions had clear incentives about what to copy and what to let fade. Administrative documents from the Merovingian period. No value to Carolingian administrators who had established their own systems. Diplomatic correspondence with Merovingian kings. Potentially embarrassing evidence that they were treated as legitimate rulers by foreign powers. Literary works celebrating Merovingian achievements, directly contradictory to the narrative that Carolingian historians were constructing. Legal codes and royal judgments. Why preserve evidence that Merovingians governed competently? Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks survived. But consider what made it acceptable for Carolingian copyists. It's full of Merovingian violence, scandal, and family conflict. It portrays a dynasty tearing itself apart through assassination and betrayal. This fits perfectly with the narrative of Merovingian degeneracy. Other contemporary histories, which may have been more favourable or focused on administrative achievements rather than royal scandals, disappeared completely. We know they existed because later texts reference them, but no copies survived the selective preservation of Carolingian scriptoria. Sometimes, evidence appears in unexpected places. A single page of a Merovingian legal code discovered in a book binding where the parchment was reused as structural material. A few lines of poetry in the margin of a later manuscript, copied by a scribe who found them interesting but didn't preserve the full work. These fragments suggest a vast literature that was systematically not preserved. Then there are the palimpsests. Parchment was so valuable that monasteries scraped old texts off and reused the material for new texts. For centuries, these erased writings were lost. But modern imaging technology, ultraviolet light, multispectral photography, advanced digital processing can recover the scraped-away text beneath later writing. What's being discovered in these palimpsests is revealing. Merovingian-era texts, showing sophistication in Latin composition, knowledge of classical literature, theological sophistication. These texts weren't preserved because they were considered unimportant or barbaric. They were actively erased, their parchment reused for texts the Carolingian establishment deemed more valuable. The physical destruction of the evidence was literal, scraped away so thoroughly that it became invisible for over 1,000 years. This creates a profound historical problem. We're trying to understand a civilization through an archive that was curated by its enemies. The texts that survived were chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to support a particular narrative. The texts that disappeared would have challenged that narrative. But written records could be controlled. Physical evidence, the things buried in the ground, the buildings constructed in stone, the objects made of metal and glass survived more randomly, and those physical remains reveal truths that the textual record tried to hide. They were buried with treasures from 3 continents, with objects that proved sophistication and wealth, and historians filed these discoveries away as interesting but exceptional, as if every tomb we find is an exception to a rule that was never real. In 1653, a mason working in Tournai broke through into an underground chamber. Inside lay the tomb of Childeric I, son of Merovech, one of the dynasty's founding figures. The grave had remained sealed for nearly 1,200 years. What it contained should have revolutionized understanding of the Merovingian period immediately. 300 gold coins, a solid gold sword hilt, elaborate weapons with gold and garnet decoration, a crystal ball suggesting ceremonial or magical power, jewelry using techniques from across the Mediterranean, gold bees, hundreds of them, that had decorated his burial garments. These weren't trinkets. This was wealth on a scale comparable to any Byzantine emperor's burial. This was sophistication in metalwork, rivaling the finest craftsmen of Constantinople. The discovery was documented, the treasures transferred to the Louvre. And then something strange happened. Historical scholarship largely ignored it. Oh, it was mentioned. It was catalogued. But its implications were dismissed. These were described as plunder from Rome, or exceptional preservation of Roman techniques, rather than evidence of Merovingian prosperity and craft sophistication. The discovery remained a curiosity, rather than becoming the foundation for reimagining the entire period. In 1831, most of the Chalderic treasure was stolen from the Louvre and melted down for the gold. But even before that, it had received remarkably little serious scholarly attention given its significance. Why? Because it contradicted the narrative. If one accepted what the grave contained at face value, the entire Dark Ages framework collapsed. The pattern repeats. In the 1950 seconds, excavations at Saint-Denis uncovered the tomb of Queen Arnegunde. Her body had been preserved well enough that her clothing survived intact. The textiles revealed advanced weaving techniques, elaborate embroidery, and Byzantine stylistic influences in the decoration. Her jewelry showed connections to trade networks extending from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. The burial goods demonstrated wealth and sophistication that didn't fit the standard story of Merovingian Francia as a primitive backwater. Archaeologists documented everything carefully. Then the discovery was filed away as interesting but not paradigm-shifting. The burial was described as exceptional rather than typical. Arnegunde's sophistication was attributed to her personal Byzantine connections rather than seen as evidence of normal elite Merovingian culture. Across Francia, similar discoveries accumulated: elite Merovingian graves containing glasswork from Syria, metalwork using Scandinavian techniques, silk from China, garnets from India, coins from Byzantium and Persia, each burial demonstrating international trade connections, considerable wealth, and access to luxury goods from across the known world. But each discovery was treated individually as an isolated exception. The pattern wasn't acknowledged. If historians accepted that these burials represented normal elite Merovingian culture rather than rare anomalies, they would have to revise their understanding of the period entirely. The Dark Ages label would become untenable. The barbarian characterization would be revealed as propaganda. The entire Carolingian narrative of bringing civilization to chaos would collapse. So instead, a taxonomy of dismissal emerged. Finds were exceptional. Objects were late Roman holdovers. Sophistication was Byzantine influence. Wealth was plunder from raids. Every discovery that contradicted the narrative received an explanation that preserved the narrative, rather than challenging it. Modern archaeology has made this position untenable. Excavations across Francia consistently reveal Merovingian sites with similar patterns of wealth, craft sophistication, and international connections. There are too many exceptions for the rule to stand. The normal standard of elite Merovingian culture was sophisticated, wealthy, and internationally connected. The barbaric chaos was the exception, not the norm. Yet the old narrative persists in popular understanding. Museum exhibits still relegate Merovingian artifacts to small displays. History textbooks still use cautious language when describing Merovingian civilization. The archaeological evidence exists in storage rooms and scholarly publications, but it hasn't penetrated public consciousness the way it should have decades ago. The graves don't lie. They can't be rewritten like manuscripts. They can't be scraped clean like palimpsests. They sat in the ground, preserving evidence that contradicts centuries of historical narrative. And when they're excavated, that evidence demands answers that the traditional story can't provide. Physical evidence isn't limited to graves. It exists in architecture, scattered across Europe, often hiding in plain sight, misattributed or misdated, to avoid acknowledging its Merovingian origin. The buildings are still there. You can visit them. You can touch the walls they built. But the signs outside call them late Roman or early medieval, never Merovingian, because admitting who built them would require rewriting the guidebooks, and the history books, and the story we've been telling about the Dark Ages. Near Poitiers, there's an underground chapel called the Hypogeum of Dunes. Descend the stairs, and you enter a carved stone chamber with columns, painted walls, and architectural sophistication that immediately raises questions. It's officially dated to the 7th century, but walk through most historical treatments, and you'll find it described as late Roman survival or showing unusual classical influence. The word Merovingian appears reluctantly, if at all. Why? Because acknowledging that Merovingians built sophisticated underground chapels with carved stonework and decorative painting would contradict the narrative of architectural decline during the Dark Ages. It's easier to attribute anything sophisticated to lingering Roman techniques than to credit the civilization that actually constructed it. The baptistery of Saint-Jean in Poitiers tells a similar story. The building contains construction phases spanning the 4th through 7th centuries. The Merovingian renovations show architectural ambition, skilled stonework, and decorative sophistication, but guidebooks emphasize the Roman foundations and the later medieval additions. The Merovingian work receives brief mention as transitional or showing continued use of Roman techniques. The implication is clear. Romans built things well, medieval Christians built things well, but the Merovingians in between just maintained what existed, except the architectural analysis doesn't support that. The Merovingian phases show original design choices, new construction techniques, and aesthetic decisions distinct from both Roman and later Carolingian styles. This was living architecture, not mere maintenance. Across Francia, churches contain Merovingian foundations, crypts, or architectural elements incorporated into later buildings. When excavations beneath Carolingian-era churches reveal sophisticated Merovingian stonework underneath, it's described as surprising or exceptional. As if every time evidence appears that contradicts the narrative, it must be an exception rather than a data point demanding narrative revision. Then there are the sarcophagi. Southern Francia contains hundreds of Merovingian stone coffins, elaborately carved with Christian symbols, geometric patterns, and decorative elements. These represent a thriving stoneworking industry, skilled craftsmen, standardized iconography, and widespread artistic production. They're clear evidence of a culture producing sophisticated carved stone on an industrial scale. Yet walk through most museums and you'll struggle to find them on display. They exist in storage, occasionally appearing in specialist exhibitions but rarely featured in general medieval art galleries. The Carolingian period's artistic achievements receive entire galleries. The Merovingian evidence receives footnotes. This disparity isn't justified by the quality or quantity of evidence. It reflects the enduring influence of historical narrative. Carolingian architecture is celebrated as evidence of Charlemagne's Renaissance, proof that civilization returned to Francia under capable leadership. If Merovingian architecture received equivalent attention, it would reveal that the civilization never left, that the Renaissance was building on existing foundations rather than creating from nothing. The pattern of misattribution extends beyond Francia. Buildings across Europe officially dated as early medieval or post-Roman are being re-evaluated by architectural historians using improved dating techniques. Stone analysis, construction method, examination, and stylistic comparison are revealing more and more structures as Merovingian in origin. Each revelation requires quiet revision of previous attributions. Each admission that a building is actually Merovingian chips away at the narrative of architectural darkness. But revisions happen slowly in archaeology and architectural history. Once a building receives an official designation, changing that designation requires overcoming institutional inertia. Museums don't want to rewrite displays. Guidebooks don't want to revise descriptions. Tour guides don't want to relearn narratives. So buildings remain mislabeled, officially dated to periods before or after the Merovingians built them, because acknowledging the truth would cascade into too many other necessary revisions. You can visit these sites today. You can see the stonework, examine the construction techniques, observe the architectural sophistication. The evidence is tangible, visible, physically present, but the interpretive signs won't tell you who actually built them. The brochures will use vague terms like early medieval or transitional period. The Merovingian origin will be mentioned quietly, in academic footnotes, if at all. We've established what was erased and how it was done. Now, we must understand why. What made the Merovingians so threatening that their memory had to be controlled? The answer lies in what they represented something later powers couldn't tolerate. They claimed to be kings and priests, rulers and saints. and the church had to accept it because to reject it would mean rejecting the entire Frankish conversion. But after they fell, the church made sure no one else would make that claim again. Merovingian kingship was different, not just in degree but in kind. Most medieval kings ruled with church approval, received ecclesiastical blessing, and acknowledged that their authority came through divine appointment, mediated by bishops and popes. The Merovingians claimed something more radical, that their blood itself carried divine grace, that their sacred authority existed independently of ecclesiastical mediation. Early sources describe Merovingian kings performing functions that would later be exclusively clerical. They blessed harvests. They healed the sick through touch, their hands carrying power that didn't require ordination or ecclesiastical delegation. They consecrated churches, not as patrons asking bishops to perform ceremonies, but as figures whose presence itself sanctified space. These weren't symbolic gestures or ceremonial honors. These were assertions of direct sacred authority. The queens exercised similar power. Clotilde, wife of Clovis, didn't just influence her husband's conversion to Christianity. She intervened in theological disputes with an authority that suggests contemporaries treated her as having quasi-clerical status. Radegund, who left her royal marriage to found a monastery, functioned as both abbess and prophet, her pronouncements treated as divinely inspired. These women weren't confined to secular roles. They operated in religious spheres usually reserved for ordained clergy. Merovingian burial practices reveal similar assumptions. The graves contain positioning and goods suggesting these kings expected to function as intercessors for their people in the afterlife, not as souls requiring intercession from saints, but as figures who would themselves mediate between their subjects and the divine. This inverted the normal Christian hierarchy, where ecclesiastical saints interceded for secular rulers. The long hair carried explicitly religious meaning. Contemporary texts compared it to biblical Samson's hair, the source of his God-given strength. They referenced priestly Nazarites, who consecrated themselves to God through uncut hair. The Merovingians saw themselves as consecrated, set apart for sacred purposes, without requiring ordination. Their kingship was a form of priesthood inherent in bloodline rather than bestowed through ceremony. This created profound theological problems for the institutional church. If kings possessed inherent sacred authority through bloodline, what role did bishops play? Could ecclesiastical officials call kings to account? Or were these sacred rulers answerable only to God? The Merovingian model implied a parallel hierarchy of sacred authority that potentially rivaled episcopal power. The tension appears repeatedly in church councils and theological writings throughout the Merovingian period. Bishops argued that legitimate rulership required ecclesiastical consecration. They insisted that royal authority, like all authority, flowed through the church's sacramental system. They tried to establish that coronation and anointing by clergy were necessary for legitimate kingship. The Merovingians never explicitly rejected these arguments. They accepted Christian baptism. They allowed bishops to bless their rule. They participated in ecclesiastical ceremonies. But they never acknowledged that these ceremonies created their authority. Their actions consistently implied that royal power existed before and independently of church blessing. The ceremonies recognized authority that already existed rather than creating it. This wasn't merely theoretical. It determined who could hold bishops accountable, who could call church councils, who could intervene in theological disputes. If kings derived authority from sacred blood, they were peers or superiors of bishops in the sacred hierarchy. If kings derived authority from ecclesiastical consecration, they were subordinate to church officials, who could theoretically withdraw that consecration. The Merovingian position made them simultaneously valuable and threatening to the church. Valuable because their existing sacred authority, when brought into Christianity, converted entire populations who followed their sacred kings into the faith. Threatening because once converted, they represented a model of Christian kingship that didn't depend on ecclesiastical control. After the Merovingians fell, the church moved decisively to ensure no dynasty would claim similar authority again. The Carolingian model kingship through papal consecration became the standard. Royal authority would flow from ecclesiastical blessing. Kings would be made, not born. The sacred bloodline model was discredited and forgotten, presented as a primitive pre-Christian survival rather than a legitimate form of Christian kingship. But Merovingian sacred kingship wasn't just theory. It manifested in specific religious practices and beliefs that historians have found deeply uncomfortable to discuss because they suggest Merovingian Christianity retained pre-Christian elements that shouldn't have survived. Their Christianity wasn't the Christianity that won, and history is written by those whose version of faith becomes orthodoxy. Open a Merovingian grave, and you find contradictions. A Christian cross on the deceased's chest, but also amulets with symbols that predate Christianity by centuries. Burial goods arranged according to beliefs about the afterlife that don't quite match Orthodox Christian theology about death and resurrection. Objects with pre-Christian sacred significance placed alongside items marking Christian identity. This isn't heresy. This is syncretism, the blending of religious traditions that characterizes nearly every religious conversion in human history. Christianity didn't replace pagan beliefs cleanly. It absorbed them, transformed them, Christianized them. What made Merovingian Francia distinctive was how visible this process remained. The royal regalia incorporated symbols that had pre-Roman Gallic sacred meanings. Bees appeared repeatedly in Merovingian royal imagery. Remember those gold bees in Childeric's tomb? Bees had symbolic significance in pre-Christian Gallic religion, associated with sovereignty and the divine. The Merovingians adopted them into Christian kingship symbolism without entirely erasing their older meanings. Toads appeared on some royal seals and decorative objects, creatures that held sacred significance in pre-Christian Frankish tradition. Place names across Merovingian Francia reveal the pattern more broadly. Sites sacred to pre-Christian deities became sites of Christian churches, often dedicated to saints whose feast days coincided with ancient festival dates. This was deliberate policy. Pope Gregory the Great explicitly instructed missionaries to Christianize pagan sites rather than destroy them. But in Francia, the transition left traces more visible than church authorities preferred. The cult of Saint Martin of Tours demonstrates the complexity. Martin was a real Roman soldier who became bishop and died in 397. But the veneration practices at his shrine incorporated elements that looked suspiciously like pre-Christian solar deity worship. Processions followed patterns that matched older seasonal rituals. Healing practices attributed to Martin's intercession resembled pre-Christian sacred healing traditions. The Christian saint seemed to have absorbed the functions of whatever deity had been venerated at that location before. Some saints venerated intensely in Merovingian Francia have no Roman martyr origins at all. Their hagiographies are vague about dates and places. Their miracles follow patterns from pre-Christian mythology. These may represent Christianized local deities, figures too important to their communities to be erased, so they were recast as Christian saints instead. The Church accepted this because it facilitated conversion, but it created a distinctly Frankish Christianity that diverged from Roman or Byzantine norms. Merovingian burial practices suggest beliefs about death that mixed Christian and pre-Christian concepts. Bodies were oriented according to traditions that predated Christianity. Grave goods included items the deceased might need in an afterlife that sounded more like warrior paradise than Christian heaven. These weren't pagans pretending to be Christians. These were Christians whose understanding of their faith incorporated older traditions that hadn't been fully displaced. This created a Frankish Christianity that was different. Not wrong, not heretical, but different from the standardized Roman Christianity that would eventually dominate Europe. Different liturgical practices, different saint cults, different assumptions about how sacred power worked, different relationships between secular and religious authority. When the Carolingians came to power, they initiated religious reforms explicitly designed to bring Frankish Christianity into alignment with Roman norms. They standardized liturgy. They purged saint cults that lacked proper Roman credentials. They enforced burial practices that matched Orthodox theology. They corrected what they saw as syncretistic deviations from proper Christian practice. This religious standardization required reinterpreting or erasing Merovingian religious practices. The distinctive Frankish Christianity that had developed under Merovingian rule became an embarrassment to be corrected rather than a cultural adaptation to be acknowledged. Merovingian religious distinctiveness was portrayed as primitive confusion or crypto-paganism, rather than simply a different path of Christian development. The reforms succeeded so thoroughly that most people today don't know Frankish Christianity ever looked different. The Carolingian version became the Christianity of France, eventually spreading across much of Europe. The Merovingian version disappeared into the historical shadows, along with the dynasty itself. The most explosive aspect of Merovingian sacred claims has been colonized by conspiracy theories and fringe speculation. But beneath the sensationalism lies a real historical question. What exactly did the Merovingians believe about their bloodline, And why was suppressing that belief so important? Conspiracy theories have made a circus of this question. But beneath the circus is a real historical mystery. What did they believe about their blood that was so powerful it couldn't be disproven, only forgotten? This territory has been colonized by pseudo-history. Books claiming the Merovingians descended from Jesus Christ. Novels spinning fantasies about sacred bloodlines and hidden secrets. Theories so thoroughly discredited that serious historians avoid the topic entirely rather than risk association with the fringe speculation. But avoiding the question doesn't make it disappear. There's a legitimate historical puzzle here. What exactly did contemporaries believe about Merovingian blood that made it sacred? Not what modern conspiracy theorists claim, but what the historical sources actually reveal about how this dynasty's bloodline was perceived. Byzantine sources describe the Merovingians as long-haired kings, with customs that marked them as different from other Christian rulers. Arab chroniclers, encountering Frankish embassies, note that these kings have practices and claims unlike other European monarchs. Even Western sources, including ones hostile to the Merovingians, acknowledge that their blood was considered inherently royal in ways that other dynasties' blood wasn't. This suggests contemporaries perceived something distinctive about Merovingian bloodline claims that set them apart from the standard medieval royal genealogy game. Most dynasties trace descent from biblical figures, Roman emperors, or legendary heroes. The Merovingians claimed something else, something that predated Christianity entirely, something autochthonous to the Frankish people themselves. The sea creature origin story makes sense in this context. It wasn't trying to connect the dynasty to Christian sacred history. It was asserting a separate sacred origin, one that existed before and independently of Christian legitimacy structures. When the Merovingians converted to Christianity, they brought this existing sacred status into the new faith, rather than deriving sacred status from Christian sources. This made them uniquely valuable as converts. They weren't tribal chieftains accepting Christianity from position of weakness or cultural inferiority. They were sacred kings who chose to align their existing divine authority with the Christian God. Their conversion brought entire populations into Christianity, because those populations followed their sacred kings into the new faith. But it also made them uniquely problematic. Their authority didn't derive from Christian sources. It couldn't be revoked by Christian authorities. It existed in parallel to ecclesiastical power structures, rather than subordinate to them. As long as the Merovingian model persisted, the Church couldn't claim exclusive control over legitimate authority in Christian society. The bloodline belief likely preserved memory of a pre-Christian Frankish royal cult. Most Germanic tribes had sacred kingship traditions, rulers who descended from gods, whose blood carried divine properties, whose presence brought fertility and victory. The Merovingians probably emerged from such traditions among the Salian Franks in the 4th or 5th centuries. Their origin mythology would have served the same function all such mythologies serve, legitimizing power through claims of special ancestry. What made this mythology particularly powerful was that it couldn't be easily disproven. If you claimed descent from Roman emperors, historians could check genealogies. If you claimed descent from biblical figures, theologians could question the connections. But if you claimed descent from a mystery, from something that occurred before recorded history, from a union that was explicitly outside normal human categories, how could that be challenged? You couldn't disprove it. You could only forget it. And that's exactly what happened. Later dynasties didn't try to refute Merovingian bloodline claims. They simply stopped talking about them. They changed the subject to Carolingian achievements. They reframed kingship around different legitimizing principles. They allowed the memory to fade until most people didn't remember the claim had ever been made. We'll never fully know what the Merovingians themselves believed about their sacred blood. The sources are too sparse and too filtered through hostile or uncomfortable witnesses. But we can observe how later dynasties treated that belief as dangerous enough to require systematic suppression rather than direct refutation. We've explored what made the Merovingians distinctive. Now we must understand the consequences of their overthrow, how the Carolingian takeover transformed European political and religious culture in ways that still shape our world. The Carolingians didn't just take power, they changed what power meant, and in doing so, they created the political theology that would define European civilization and the constant warfare between church and state for a millennium. Two models of kingship faced each other across the divide of 751. On one side stood the Merovingian conception. Kings ruled by inherent blood right. Their authority was inalienable. Their power was sacred and magical, flowing from within rather than bestowed from without. A Merovingian was born king. Nothing could make him more of a king, and nothing could unmake what blood had created. The long hair proved it. The sacred bloodline guaranteed it. On the other side stood the Carolingian innovation. Kings ruled by ecclesiastical consecration. Their authority derived from papal anointing. Their power was a Christian duty delegated by God through his church. A Carolingian became king through ceremony, through the laying on of hands, through holy oil applied by bishops who acted as God's representatives on earth. The crown was granted, and what could be granted could potentially be withdrawn. This was revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond simply changing which family sat on the throne. It meant kingship was no longer an immutable property of bloodline, but a relationship between ruler and church. It meant kings could be made and unmade by religious authority. It meant royal power was conditional on proper Christian behavior, on obedience to ecclesiastical guidance, on maintaining the favor of those who had consecrated them. The innovations came in stages, each one establishing precedent that would echo through centuries. In 754, Pepin the Short received consecration from Pope Stephen II in a ceremony carefully designed to emphasize that papal blessing created legitimate kingship. The Pope didn't merely recognize Pepin's power, he transformed that power into legitimate authority through religious ritual. The message was clear. What the Church makes sacred, only the Church can unmake. Charlemagne's imperial coronation in 800 took this further. Pope Leo III placed the imperial crown on Charlemagne's head on Christmas Day in Rome, deliberately invoking the memory of Rome's Christian emperors. This created a direct line of imperial legitimacy from Constantine to Charlemagne. With papal consecration as the mechanism of transmission, European imperial authority now flowed through Rome and through the Church, not from any secular source. Coronation rituals evolved to emphasize that kings received authority from above through church mediation, rather than inheriting it from within through sacred blood. The ceremonies developed elaborate symbolism. The anointing with holy oil that made kings into quasi-clerical figures, the oath-taking that bound them to Christian duties, the investiture with regalia by ecclesiastical authorities. Every element reinforced the message that legitimate power descended from God through his church to properly consecrated rulers. This model was profoundly disempowering to secular rulers in one sense. They were now subordinate to church judgment, accountable to bishops and popes who could question their legitimacy, threaten excommunication, or support rival claimants who seemed more pious or obedient. Kings couldn't simply be kings anymore, they had to be Christian kings, operating within boundaries defined by ecclesiastical authority. But it was empowering in another sense. Rulership was now based on merit and divine favor, rather than on the accident of birth into a specific bloodline. Any competent, pious ruler could potentially be consecrated king. Any dynasty could claim the throne if they could secure church support. This opened kingship to the Carolingians initially, but eventually to all the dynasties that succeeded them across Europe. No longer did you need magical blood to rule. You needed military power, political skill, and ecclesiastical backing. European political history for the next 1,000 years would be shaped by the tension this created. Secular rulers constantly tried to exercise independent authority, to claim that their crowns gave them powers the church couldn't limit. Church authorities constantly insisted on their right to grant or withhold legitimacy, to judge whether kings were ruling properly, to support or oppose secular powers based on religious criteria. This political revolution required a cultural revolution to support it. The Carolingians needed to change not just who ruled, but how people thought about history, culture, and civilization itself. They called it a renaissance, a rebirth of learning. But every renaissance requires deciding what gets reborn and what gets left in the grave. The Carolingian Renaissance wasn't spontaneous cultural flourishing. It was a deliberate political program designed to consolidate power through control of knowledge. Charlemagne understood that changing who ruled wasn't enough. He needed to change how people understood their past, their culture, their very identity as Franks and Christians. His court became a gathering place for scholars from across Europe. Alcuin came from England, bringing Anglo-Saxon learning. Theodulf came from Spain, carrying Visigothic scholarly traditions. Paul the Deacon came from Italy, connecting the court to Roman cultural memory. These weren't random appointments. Each scholar brought different pieces of the cultural mosaic. Charlemagne wanted to create a standardized Christian Latin culture that would unite his empire and legitimize his rule. The project had specific, practical goals. Standardize Latin so that administrative documents, liturgy, and scholarship used consistent language across the empire. Standardize liturgy so that religious practices were uniform, eliminating regional variations that might preserve Merovingian-era traditions. Standardize education so that clergy and administrators learned the same texts with the same interpretations. Standardize historiography so that the past was remembered the way the Carolingian court needed it remembered. The development of Carolingian minuscule script exemplifies the programme's dual nature. This new writing style was genuinely an improvement, clearer, more readable, more efficient than previous scripts. But adopting it required recopying all older manuscripts. And in that recopying, editors made choices. They corrected texts they considered corrupt. They updated language they deemed archaic. They removed passages they considered irrelevant or problematic. Every manuscript that passed through Carolingian scriptoria was filtered through Carolingian judgment about what was worth preserving and how it should be presented. This created an extraordinary power. The Carolingians controlled which texts survived. Classical works persisted because Carolingian scholars valued them. Early Christian writings survived because they fit Carolingian theological frameworks. But Merovingian-era texts that didn't serve Carolingian purposes, administrative documents showing Merovingian competence, chronicles emphasizing Merovingian achievements, literary works celebrating Merovingian culture, those could simply not be copied. Within a few generations, as older manuscripts decayed, the Carolingian versions became the only versions. Their editorial choices became permanent. The liturgical standardization had similar effects. Regional variations in Christian practice, many dating to the Merovingian period, were eliminated in favor of Roman uniformity. Local saints whose cults didn't meet Roman standards were quietly removed from official calendars. Practices that seemed too syncretistic with pre-Christian traditions were banned. The distinctive Frankish Christianity that had developed under Merovingian rule was replaced with standardized Roman Christianity. Official histories produced at Charlemagne's court established the narrative framework that would persist for centuries. These histories portrayed Frankish history as a progression from tribal chaos to Merovingian disorder to Carolingian order. They created the image of lazy, degenerate Merovingian kings that modern audiences would inherit. They positioned Charlemagne as the founder of European Christian civilization, rather than simply as the conqueror who overthrew an existing kingdom. Historians celebrate the Carolingian Renaissance for saving classical culture. They credit Charlemagne's scriptoria with preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost. This celebration isn't wrong. Many important works survived only because Carolingian scholars copied them. But it ignores what was lost. Merovingian-era culture that didn't fit Carolingian standards disappeared. We'll never know what texts weren't copied, what traditions weren't preserved, what perspectives weren't transmitted. The silence itself is invisible because we can only miss what we know existed. The cultural project succeeded so thoroughly that it became difficult to question. It established the categories and narratives historians would use for centuries, making Carolingian biases seem like objective truth rather than the product of deliberate political and cultural engineering. Charlemagne became every nation's ancestor, the beginning of Europe as we know it, which meant everything before him had to be prehistory, even if it wasn't. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head in Rome and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The title was carefully chosen, not King of the Franks, which Charlemagne already was, not Emperor of Francia, which would acknowledge it as a new political entity, but Emperor of the Romans, claiming direct continuity with the empire that had fallen 3 centuries earlier. This wasn't merely symbolic grandeur, it was historical revision on a massive scale. By claiming to be Roman emperor, Charlemagne positioned himself as the successor to Augustus, Constantine, and the last Western emperors. It created a narrative line. Rome fell, Europe languished in darkness, and now imperial authority had been restored through Charlemagne. The Merovingian period became an interregnum, a gap in imperial succession that had finally been closed. The ideological power of this narrative was extraordinary. The Carolingians weren't usurpers who had overthrown a legitimate dynasty. They were restorers who had ended chaos and returned Europe to its proper imperial framework. They weren't revolutionaries introducing a new political order. They were renovators recovering an old one. Every innovation they made could be presented as restoration of proper Roman Christian civilization. This required minimizing Merovingian achievements. If Francia under Merovingian rule had been sophisticated, stable, and legitimate, then there was nothing to restore. The narrative of imperial restoration depended on the Merovingian period being chaotic, transitional, and inadequate. So that's how it was written. Merovingian kings had lost Roman civilization. Carolingian emperors were recovering it. The 300 years between became an unfortunate but necessary gap in European history. The narrative proved remarkably durable. When the Carolingian dynasty itself collapsed in the 9th and 10th centuries, the imperial ideology survived. Later Holy Roman emperors, ruling from Germany, claimed descent from Charlemagne's restoration rather than creating new legitimacy frameworks. They needed Charlemagne to represent the beginning of European imperial authority, because it justified their own claims. French kings, despite being a different dynasty, similarly claimed Charlemagne as their ancestor and founder. The imperial mystique transcended the dynasty that created it. Even nationalism in the 19th century reinforced this pattern. French nationalists claimed Charlemagne as the founder of France. German nationalists claimed him as the founder of Germany. Italian nationalists pointed to his coronation in Rome. Each national movement needed a founding figure, an origin point for their nation's story. Charlemagne served that purpose perfectly, but making him the beginning required everything before him to be prehistory. Transitional chaos that didn't really count as the nation's true existence. The Merovingians became victims of multiple layers of forgetting. First, the Carolingians minimized them to justify their overthrow. Then, later dynasties minimized them to maintain Carolingian imperial ideology. Then, medieval historians writing centuries later inherited these narratives and treated them as fact. Then, nationalist historians needed foundational figures and chose Charlemagne. Each generation found new reasons to push the Merovingians further into the shadows. This creates a remarkable situation. A dynasty that ruled for 300 years, that built cities still standing today, that created the territorial foundations of modern France, that converted the Franks to Christianity, and shaped European politics for centuries. That dynasty is barely remembered. Meanwhile, Charlemagne, who ruled for 46 years, is known to every schoolchild as the father of Europe. The disparity isn't justified by historical importance. It's the result of successful historical construction. The Carolingians created a narrative so powerful that it survived their own dynasty's collapse. They made Charlemagne into the beginning of European history so effectively that everything before him became merely prologue. The narrative became so dominant that even modern historians, working with critical methods and archaeological evidence, have struggled to break free from its framework. But that's finally beginning to change. The ground doesn't lie, and the ground is telling us the story we were taught was wrong. Archaeology changed everything. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that couldn't be explained away by the narratives historians had inherited. The 20th and 21st centuries brought systematic excavation to Merovingian sites across Francia. What emerged from those excavations forced uncomfortable questions about everything we thought we knew. Tours, one of the great Merovingian cities, underwent extensive archaeological investigation, starting in the 1972. Excavators expected to find evidence of urban decline, crumbling Roman buildings, shrinking populations, the physical traces of Dark Ages decay. Instead, they found continuous urban occupation through the entire Merovingian period. Workshop complexes producing textiles, metalwork, and pottery. Storage facilities suggesting organized trade. Stone construction continuing from Roman times through the Merovingian era and into the Carolingian period, without the dramatic break that textual sources suggested. The city hadn't declined. It had transformed, adapted, continued functioning. Quentovich, a Merovingian port on the English Channel, revealed similar patterns. Excavations showed extensive maritime trade networks connecting Francia with England, Scandinavia, and the Mediterranean. Imported goods from across the known world. Minting facilities producing coins for international commerce. Harbour facilities sophisticated enough to handle significant shipping traffic. This wasn't a primitive backwater. This was a functioning commercial hub, operating at levels comparable to any contemporary Byzantine or Islamic port city. Paris excavations beneath medieval and modern construction layers consistently revealed Merovingian occupation more sophisticated than historical narratives suggested. Stone buildings with architectural planning, organized street layouts, workshop districts showing specialized craft production, evidence of a city that never stopped being a city, even when historians claimed urban life had collapsed. Cemetery excavations told stories that contradicted textual accounts. Graves across Francia demonstrated wealth through goods buried with the dead. More importantly, isotope analysis of skeletal remains, a technique that can determine where people were born and lived based on chemical signatures in their bones, revealed extensive population movement. People born in Scandinavia, buried in Francia. People from the Mediterranean region, settled in northern territories. This wasn't isolated population, trapped in place by chaos. This was a mobile, connected society, with trade networks and population flows comparable to other civilizations of the same era. Landscape archaeology, using LiDAR laser scanning that penetrates forest cover to reveal ground features, has revealed extensive Merovingian agricultural and settlement systems. Organized field patterns, planned village layouts, infrastructure of a society, managing land resources systematically. The countryside wasn't abandoned or reverting to wilderness. It was actively managed, farmed, settled in patterns that suggest population density and agricultural sophistication. This evidence created cognitive dissonance. The material culture showed sophistication, prosperity, and cultural vitality. The textual sources described chaos and decline. Initially, scholars tried to reconcile this by treating archaeological discoveries as exceptions. This site was unusually prosperous. That burial was exceptionally wealthy. Those workshops represented late Roman survivals rather than Merovingian achievement. But exceptions accumulated until they could no longer be dismissed. Comprehensive Merovingian archaeological surveys published in the 1982 and 1990 revealed patterns across hundreds of sites. The sophistication wasn't exceptional, it was normal. The prosperity wasn't isolated, it was widespread. The cultural vitality wasn't accidental, it was systematic. Specific discoveries became turning points. Merovingian workshops discovered producing luxury goods not just for local use but for export demonstrated international commercial networks. Glass furnaces using techniques as sophisticated as contemporary Byzantine production proved technological capability. Mint facilities showing standardized coin production across multiple cities revealed organized economic policy. Within specialized scholarship, a revolution occurred. Serious historians no longer describe the Merovingian period as uniformly dark or declining. Academic publications routinely acknowledge Merovingian sophistication. Conference presentations assume continuity rather than collapse. The scholarly consensus shifted from viewing the Merovingian era as a regrettable gap to understanding it as a distinct civilization with its own achievements. But this scholarly revision has been slow to penetrate popular understanding. Textbooks still teach the old narratives. Museum exhibitions still present minimal Merovingian material. Popular documentaries still rush from Rome to Charlemagne. The gap between what specialists know and what the public learns remains vast. Changing popular historical understanding requires more than new evidence. It requires rewriting textbooks, redesigning museum exhibitions, producing new popular narratives. This is a massive institutional undertaking that happens across generations rather than years. Alongside archaeological revision, textual scholars have begun rereading surviving Merovingian sources with fresh eyes, finding sophistication that previous generations of historians missed or dismissed. The sources were always there. Every historian read them. They just assumed the Merovingians were too primitive to have left sophisticated records, so they didn't see what was written in plain sight. Gregory of Tours wrote his History of the Franks in the late 6th century. It's the single most important source for understanding the Merovingian period. For centuries, historians read it as a naive chronicle of violence and superstition, written by a credulous bishop who simply recorded everything he heard without critical judgment. The text was valued for its information, but dismissed for its supposed lack of sophistication. Modern scholars are discovering how wrong that interpretation was. Gregory wasn't a naive chronicler. He was a sophisticated author making deliberate choices about what to include, how to frame events, and what political messages to send. His text employs classical rhetorical techniques taught in the best Roman educational traditions. His narrative structure follows sophisticated historical models. His characterizations reveal deep understanding of political psychology and factional dynamics. Consider how Gregory navigates the dangerous politics of his era. He's writing during brutal succession conflicts, when choosing the wrong words about the wrong king could cost him his position or his life. Yet he manages to preserve information about all factions while maintaining working relationships with competing kings. That requires sophisticated political judgment and careful literary technique, not naive reporting. The documents he preserves within his narrative reveal Merovingian administration functioning at levels historians long denied. Treaties with foreign powers negotiated with diplomatic sophistication. Royal judgments applying complex legal reasoning. Administrative correspondence managing territories and resources. Gregory includes these documents because they interested him historically, but their inclusion proves Merovingian governance operated through written administration, not through crude verbal commands from barbarian chieftains. His ethnographic observations about Frankish culture, once read as recording primitive customs, now appear as valuable anthropological descriptions of a complex society. He describes legal procedures, inheritance customs, marriage practices, and religious syncretism with detail that reveals cultural complexity rather than barbarism. The sophistication was always there in his text. Readers just didn't see it because they assumed it couldn't be there. Other sources are undergoing similar re-evaluation. Venantius Fortunatus wrote poetry at Merovingian courts in the late 6th century. Generations of scholars dismissed his work as mediocre Latin verse produced in a cultural wasteland. Modern classicists reading the same poems recognize sophisticated Latin composition using advanced poetic techniques. Fortunatus was playing with classical forms, making literary allusions to Virgil and Ovid, writing for an audience educated enough to appreciate those references. His poetry reveals Merovingian court culture that valued learning and literary sophistication. The Salic law and other Merovingian legal codes were long read as primitive Germanic customs barely organized into written form. Legal historians now recognize them as sophisticated jurisprudence, showing complex understanding of property rights, inheritance law, criminal procedure, and compensation systems. These weren't tribal customs transcribed by barely literate scribes. These were carefully crafted legal documents produced by administrations that understood jurisprudence. Even hagiographies, saints' lives that historians dismissed as pious fantasy, are being mined for social and economic history. Yes, they contain miraculous elements, but they also contain detailed descriptions of landholding patterns, economic relationships, urban life, and social structures. Read carefully. They reveal a functioning society with complexity that contradicts the chaos narrative. This isn't about discovering new sources. Every text discussed here has been available and studied for centuries. What's changed is the interpretive framework. Previous generations read these sources assuming Merovingian culture was inferior to both Roman and Carolingian culture. That assumption shaped what they saw in the texts. Remove that assumption. Read the same sources with openness to finding sophistication, and complexity emerges that was always present, but invisible to scholars who believed it couldn't exist. This scholarly revision is creating a new picture of Merovingian Francia. But this picture exists primarily in specialized academic publications. The gap between scholarly knowledge and public understanding remains vast. Scholars know, archaeologists know, but the textbooks still teach the old story, because changing history isn't about finding new facts. It's about having the courage to abandon old narratives. The evidence is clear. Archaeology has demonstrated Merovingian sophistication. Textual scholars have revealed complexity in sources that were always available. Within specialized scholarship, the revision has occurred. Serious historians working on the Merovingian period no longer describe it as uniformly dark, chaotic, or primitive. The scholarly consensus has shifted. So why do textbooks still teach the old story? Why do museum exhibitions still minimize Merovingian achievements? Why do popular documentaries still rush from Rome to Charlemagne, as if nothing of consequence happened between? Institutional inertia provides part of the answer. Textbooks take decades to revise. Publishers don't update history books every year, they work on revision cycles spanning 10 or 15 years. Teachers teach what they were taught, what their textbooks contain, what the curriculum requires. Changing educational content requires coordinating curriculum committees, teacher training, textbook publishing, and standardized testing. This happens slowly, even when the will to change exists. Popular media prefers established narratives. Documentary producers want recognizable frameworks that audiences already understand. Publishers want books that fit existing market categories. Museums design exhibitions around narratives that visitors expect. Deviating from established stories requires explaining why the deviation is necessary, which adds complexity that popular media prefers to avoid. It's easier to make another documentary about Charlemagne than to explain why we've misunderstood the 300 years before him. Nationalist investment in particular historical narratives creates resistance. French identity has been tied to stories about French origins in the Carolingian period. Charlemagne is claimed as the founder of France. Revising that narrative to give proper weight to the Merovingians doesn't just change history, it changes national origin stories. Similar dynamics operate in Germany, where Charlemagne is claimed as German, and in broader European identity construction, where Charlemagne represents European unity. More subtle resistance appears in language and framing. Even historians who acknowledge Merovingian sophistication continue using Dark Ages terminology. Even exhibitions that include Merovingian material present it as specialist knowledge rather than central medieval history. Even academic writing that recognizes Merovingian achievement frames it as surprising or exceptional rather than expected. The language betrays assumptions that persist despite evidence. This resistance isn't conspiratorial. It's structural. Changing comprehensive historical narratives is hard. It requires not just accepting new evidence but abandoning frameworks that organize vast amounts of historical knowledge. If the Merovingian period wasn't actually dark or chaotic, what does that mean for how we understand late antiquity? If Carolingian achievement built on sophisticated Merovingian foundations rather than creating from chaos, how do we understand the entire medieval period? Dramatic revisions create cascading questions that make scholars uncomfortable. There's also psychological resistance. If professional historians were this wrong about the Merovingian period, if they inherited and perpetuated Carolingian propaganda for over a millennium without recognizing it, what else might be similarly distorted in our historical understanding? That's an uncomfortable question. It's easier to acknowledge gradual revision than to admit fundamental narrative failure. But change is happening. New generations of scholars less invested in older narratives are gradually shifting consensus. Popular media is beginning to reflect this, slowly. Museum exhibitions are being redesigned to give Merovingian material more prominence. Textbook revisions are incorporating new archaeological findings. The process is generational rather than immediate, but it's occurring. This documentary is part of that shift, bringing scholarly revision to wider audiences, explaining why the Merovingian period matters, making the case that recovering this history isn't just academic correction, but something more important. Because recovering Merovingian history isn't just about correcting a mistake. It has implications for how we understand power, legitimacy, and historical narrative itself. It raises questions about whose stories get told and whose get buried. It reveals how completely victors can control memory, and it forces us to ask what else we think we know about the past that might be similarly constructed rather than simply true. The Merovingians aren't ancient history, they're a warning. Because if 300 years of empire can vanish from memory, what else are we forgetting? What else are we being told to forget? Step back from medieval Francia for a moment and consider what we've actually been examining. Not just the fate of one dynasty, but the mechanics of how historical narratives get constructed, maintained, and naturalized until they seem like simple truth rather than deliberate construction. The Merovingian erasure is an extreme example, but the process it reveals operates everywhere, in every society, throughout all of human history. Every civilization constructs origin, myths, and historical narratives that serve present purposes. These aren't lies, exactly. They're frameworks for organizing facts, deciding what matters and what doesn't, determining which stories get told prominently and which get relegated to footnotes. The narratives serve national identity, justify political legitimacy, reinforce cultural values. This is normal. This is how societies work. But it's also how truth gets distorted until distortion becomes indistinguishable from fact. Consider American history as taught in schools for most of the 20th century. Indigenous civilizations were minimized, portrayed as primitive peoples inhabiting empty wilderness, rather than as complex societies managing sophisticated agricultural and political systems. This erasure served a purpose. It made European colonization seem like bringing civilization to emptiness, rather than destroying civilizations that already existed. The narrative wasn't maintained through book burning or censorship, but through emphasis, through what got included in textbooks and what got treated as minor detail, through assumptions about what constituted real civilization and what was merely tribal existence. Colonial powers everywhere wrote histories portraying colonized peoples as primitive, as needing European guidance, as benefiting from colonization. These weren't random stories but systematic narratives that justified present power arrangements. And they worked. Generations absorbed these narratives, internalized them, repeated them until they became common sense. Only sustained scholarly work and political pressure forced revision. Soviet historiography rewrote Russian history to support communist ideology. Pre-revolutionary Russia was portrayed as uniformly oppressive and backwards. Revolutionary heroes were emphasized while complicating details were minimized. Entire populations that suffered under Soviet policies disappeared from official histories or had their suffering reframed as necessary sacrifice. The narrative machinery operated through control of archives, publishing, and education, not crude censorship, but systematic emphasis on approved narratives. These aren't random examples. They're patterns revealing how power operates through narrative control. People in positions of authority naturally favor narratives that justify their authority. These narratives get embedded in institutions, schools, museums, publishing houses, media organizations. They get repeated until repetition makes them seem true. New generations inherit these narratives and rarely think to question them, because questioning requires first recognizing that what seems like objective history is actually constructed narrative. The Merovingian case is valuable precisely because it's old enough to examine without triggering contemporary political defensiveness. We can look clearly at how the Carolingians managed narrative control, how they used institutional power to shape what got remembered and what got forgotten, how they constructed a version of history that served their purposes so effectively that it persisted for over a millennium. We can see the mechanics without the fog of contemporary political stakes, and those mechanics are remarkably consistent across time and place. Control what gets emphasized in official narratives, ensure institutions responsible for preserving and transmitting knowledge, adopt your framework, wait for generational turnover to naturalize your narrative until it stops seeming like interpretation and starts seeming like fact. Maintain control long enough, and alternative narratives simply fade from memory, not because they were disproven, but because they stopped being repeated. Understanding this process matters because it's still happening. Different actors, different contexts, but similar mechanisms. Historical narratives aren't fixed bodies of facts waiting to be discovered. They're ongoing arguments about interpretation, emphasis, and meaning. Every historical claim serves purposes beyond simply describing what happened. Every framework for organizing historical facts reflects choices about what matters. Vigilance about historical narratives is a form of political awareness, asking who benefits from particular historical framings, what gets minimized or excluded, what assumptions make narratives seem natural. These aren't paranoid questions. They're essential critical thinking in societies where narrative control remains a fundamental mechanism of power. Historical narratives don't just affect how we understand the past. They shape our present identity and determine what political possibilities we can imagine. The Merovingian erasure had specific, traceable consequences for European political development. When Pope Francis negotiates with nations, when parliaments debate church influence in education, when we argue about separation of church and state, we're still arguing about what the Carolingians decided in 751 CE. The Carolingian overthrow of the Merovingians wasn't just a dynastic change. It was a political revolution that created frameworks still structuring European and Western politics 13 centuries later. The consequences are traceable, specific, and ongoing. The Carolingian model established that legitimate kingship derived from ecclesiastical consecration rather than bloodline. This created permanent tension between secular rulers wanting independent authority and church officials insisting that legitimacy flowed through them. Every major medieval political crisis stemmed from this tension. The investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries, the conflict over whether secular rulers or church officials appointed bishops, was fundamentally about whether kings ruled independently or as Christian officials, accountable to papal authority. The Carolingian model had established that proper kingship required church blessing, but it left ambiguous what happened when church and king disagreed. The conflict tore Europe apart for generations. The struggles between Holy Roman emperors and popes throughout the medieval period followed the same pattern. Emperors claimed authority from their coronation, which gave them independent power. Popes claimed that their act of coronation created that authority, which meant they could withdraw it. Both sides cited Carolingian precedents to support their positions. The ambiguity built into the Carolingian model of consecrated kingship guaranteed ongoing conflict. Even the English break with Rome under Henry VIII operated within this framework. Henry wasn't rejecting Christianity, or even questioning that kings should be Christian. He was asserting that royal authority existed independently of papal approval, essentially returning to something closer to the Merovingian model, where kingship was inherent rather than granted. The Pope's refusal to annul Henry's marriage became the trigger, but the underlying question was Carolingian. Does the Church make kings, or do kings exist independently? The Protestant Reformation involved many theological issues, but politically, it represented different solutions to the church-state tension created by Carolingian political theology. Lutheran territories resolved it by making secular rulers heads of their territorial churches. Calvinist areas developed theories of resistance to ungodly rulers. Catholic regions maintained papal supremacy, but all were responding to tensions inherent in the model established when the Carolingians replaced blood-based kingship with consecration-based kingship. If the Merovingian model had persisted kingship as inherent, blood-based, independent of ecclesiastical validation, European political development would have looked fundamentally different. Perhaps more like Byzantine Caesaropapism, where emperors controlled church administration and theology. Perhaps like Islamic models where religious and political authority were theoretically unified. Or perhaps like Eastern monarchies where divine kingship operated through different mechanisms entirely. This isn't to say one model was better. Each creates different tensions, different opportunities, different problems. But the Carolingian model created specific dynamics that shaped everything that followed. The constant negotiation between secular and religious authority, the development of ideas about limited kingship and accountability, even eventual concepts of separation of church and state, all emerged from tensions built into how the Carolingians justified their seizure of power. National identity formation in the 19th century also operated within Carolingian frameworks. Creating linear narratives from barbarian tribes to medieval kingdoms to modern nations required minimizing messy complications. The Merovingians complicated French national mythology. They were Frankish but not French in ways nationalist historians wanted. They ruled territory that became France, but their dynasty ended without direct succession to later French kings. Simpler to start the story with Charlemagne, who could be claimed as founder without uncomfortable questions about what came before. Contemporary European political institutions carry Carolingian DNA. Constitutional monarchies where kings reign but don't rule echo the separation between sacred kingship and practical governance. Debates about church influence in education revisit medieval arguments about whose authority supersedes whose. Discussions about religious freedom and establishment operate within frameworks first articulated to resolve Carolingian-era tensions. We're still living in political and religious structures partially designed to justify a coup that happened 13 centuries ago. The arrangements made then to legitimize Carolingian rule became embedded in European political culture so deeply that they seem natural rather than contingent. Beyond broad political implications, the Merovingian case study has personal relevance. It teaches us how to think critically about any narrative we're given, historical or otherwise. They want history to feel settled, established, complete. But every historical fact was once a present moment, complicated and unclear, and every current moment will someday be history shaped by whoever gets to tell the story. The Merovingian erasure teaches a lesson about narrative fragility. Historical truth is more delicate than we assume. Narratives can be controlled through selective emphasis rather than crude censorship. Understanding this changes how we approach information in any context. The Carolingians didn't burn libraries or execute chroniclers. They didn't need to. They controlled which texts got copied, which stories got emphasized, which interpretive frameworks became standard in educational institutions. Subtle bias, maintained consistently across generations, compounds until alternative narratives simply disappear, not because they were disproven but because they stopped being repeated. This process required no conspiracy, no coordinated master plan. It emerged from incentive structures. Carolingian-era monasteries had every reason to emphasize narratives that pleased Carolingian rulers who funded them. Later, copyists had no reason to preserve texts that contradicted established narratives. Teachers taught what their textbooks contained, and textbooks reflected what earlier generations had established as important. Each decision seemed reasonable individually. Collectively, they erased 300 years of sophisticated civilization from popular memory. Consider how this connects to contemporary information dynamics. We live in an age of information abundance, not scarcity. Narrative control doesn't work through preventing access to information. It works through emphasis: what gets algorithmic promotion, what gets taught in schools, what assumptions underlie mainstream coverage, what framing makes certain interpretations seem natural while others seem fringe. The mechanisms differ, but the pattern holds. Information that fits existing narratives gets amplified through sharing, citation, and repetition. Information that challenges established frameworks requires extra effort to find and process. Over time, narratives that serve powerful interests become naturalized as common sense, while alternatives fade to margins. The Merovingian case teaches us to ask questions about any historical narrative. Who benefits from this framing? What's being minimized or excluded? What assumptions am I bringing that make this narrative seem natural? These questions apply beyond history to any narrative about how the world works. This isn't a call to embrace conspiracy thinking or reject all expertise. Expertise matters, evidence matters. Scholarly consensus emerging from careful research deserves respect. But expertise itself operates within frameworks that can have biases. Consensus can be wrong. Established narratives can reflect power arrangements rather than truth. The scholars who perpetuated the Carolingian narrative about Merovingian degeneracy weren't stupid or malicious. They were working within inherited frameworks, using established methodologies, following academic conventions. They examined sources carefully and drew conclusions that seemed reasonable given their assumptions. They were wrong not because they failed individually, but because they inherited systematic bias that was invisible to them. If professional historians could be that wrong about something as basic as whether an entire civilization was sophisticated or barbaric, what else might warrant re-examination? What other settled narratives might be waiting for revision once someone questions the right assumptions? This should inspire intellectual humility. We're all working within frameworks we inherited, making assumptions we haven't examined, seeing patterns that our conceptual tools make visible, while missing patterns those tools obscure. Being thoughtful means maintaining awareness that our understanding is provisional, that evidence might require revision, that what seems obvious to us might seem laughably wrong to future generations. It should also inspire curiosity. History isn't a closed book of established facts. It's an ongoing investigation where new evidence and new perspectives constantly demand revision. The Merovingian recovery we've traced isn't finished. Scholars are still discovering new evidence, developing new interpretations, challenging remaining assumptions. And the Merovingians aren't unique. There are certainly other suppressed histories waiting recovery, other erasures waiting exposure, other narratives waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Every dark age deserves scrutiny. Every claim that nothing important happened should trigger curiosity. Every gap in the standard narrative might hide something worth recovering. We've explored the suppression, the erasure, the recovery, and the implications. Now, in conclusion, what exactly should we remember about the Merovingians? And what does their story ultimately tell us about the nature of history itself? This is what we know. For 3 centuries, an empire flourished. It built cities, maintained civilization, preserved culture, and then it was deliberately forgotten. Now we remember, and remembering changes everything. The evidence is clear when you look at it without the filter of Carolingian narrative. The Merovingian dynasty ruled a sophisticated empire from roughly 450 to 751 CE. This wasn't a collection of tribal territories barely holding together. This was a functioning state with urban centers, international trade networks, diplomatic relationships spanning from Byzantium to Anglo-Saxon England, and cultural production that included architecture, literature, law, and art. The cities were real. Paris, Reims, Tours, Metz. These weren't ruins inhabited by scattered survivors. They were functioning urban centers with markets, workshops, churches, and administrative buildings. Archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation, ongoing construction, and economic activity throughout the Merovingian period. The roads still carried traffic. The ports still received ships from across the Mediterranean. The workshops still produced goods for local use and international export. The government functioned. Merovingian kings minted standardized coinage that circulated internationally. They maintained written legal codes showing sophisticated jurisprudence. They collected taxes and dispensed justice. They appointed administrators and conducted diplomacy. This required bureaucracy, literacy, and institutional continuity, all things the Dark Ages narrative claims didn't exist. The culture thrived. Merovingian-era texts show sophisticated Latin composition, knowledge of classical literature, and complex theological thinking. Their architecture demonstrates technical skill and aesthetic ambition. Their burial goods reveal international trade connections and considerable wealth. Their artistic production shows distinctive styles that influenced later medieval art. This wasn't cultural darkness, it was cultural transformation, creating something new from Roman and Germanic elements. But the Merovingians represented a different model of kingship than what eventually dominated Europe. They claimed authority through sacred bloodline, rather than ecclesiastical consecration. Their kings were priests as much as rulers. Their power conceived as magical and inherent rather than delegated and contingent. This made them simultaneously valuable to the church as converts and threatening as a model of Christian kingship that didn't require church mediation. When the Carolingians overthrew the last Merovingian king in 751, they didn't just change dynasties. They changed the entire conception of what legitimate kingship meant. And to justify that change, they needed to portray their predecessors as degenerate, weak, and incompetent. So that's the story that entered historical chronicles, that got copied and recopied through Carolingian scriptoria, that eventually became accepted truth. The erasure succeeded thoroughly enough that it still shapes popular understanding today. Most educated people have never heard of the Merovingians. Textbooks rush from Rome to Charlemagne. Museum exhibitions minimize or ignore 3 centuries of sophisticated civilization. The narrative of Dark Ages chaos, followed by Carolingian Renaissance, remains embedded in how medieval Europe is taught and understood. But within specialized scholarship, revision has occurred. Archaeologists have demonstrated Merovingian sophistication through physical evidence that can't be explained away. Textual scholars have found complexity in sources that were always available, but were read through Carolingian-influenced interpretive frameworks. The academic consensus has shifted from viewing the Merovingian period as dark and chaotic to understanding it as a distinct civilization with its own achievements. This isn't fringe theory or conspiracy speculation. This is increasingly mainstream academic understanding that simply hasn't penetrated public consciousness yet. The gap between what specialists know and what the general public learns remains vast, but it's closing. We must acknowledge uncertainties. Much Merovingian literature is lost. Some aspects of their religious beliefs remain unclear. Their full political thought is difficult to reconstruct. But obscurity isn't insignificance. Lack of sources isn't evidence of lack of sophistication. The gaps in our knowledge reflect what was systematically not preserved, rather than what never existed. The Merovingian story is a reminder that historical understanding is always partial, always subject to revision, always shaped by the needs and biases of those doing the interpreting. What we know about the past is filtered through what later generations chose to preserve and how they chose to frame it. The Merovingians deserve to be remembered not as a footnote, but as a major dynasty that shaped European development. They converted the Franks to Christianity. They established the territorial foundations of medieval France. They created political institutions and cultural patterns that persisted long after their dynasty ended. Remembering them accurately requires challenging deeply embedded narratives about the medieval period and about how history itself works. Beyond the specific historical facts, the Merovingian story teaches broader lessons about power, memory, and truth lessons that apply far beyond medieval history. History isn't what happened, it's what we understand about what happened. And understanding can change, should change, as we ask better questions and recognize old biases. We began with a simple question. What existed in the territory we now call France before France became France? Answering it required confronting assumptions about how history is written, preserved, and transmitted. The journey revealed something fundamental about historical knowledge itself. There's a crucial distinction between events and history. Events happened once, in the past, fixed and unchangeable. The Merovingians existed. They ruled. They built cities and made laws and fought wars. Those are facts, as certain as anything can be about the distant past. But history, the understanding and narration of those events is fluid, constantly being written and rewritten as new evidence emerges and new questions are asked. The Merovingians existed. That's fact. But whether we remember them as sophisticated empire builders or as degenerate barbarians is history. And that history has changed across time, based on who was doing the writing and what purposes their narrative served. Carolingian chroniclers wrote one version, 19th century nationalist historians wrote another, Contemporary archaeologists and textual scholars are writing yet another. Same events, different histories. This doesn't lead to relativism. Some interpretations are better supported by evidence than others. The archaeological record demonstrating Merovingian urban sophistication is stronger evidence than Carolingian chronicles claiming chaos. Physical remains of international trade networks are more reliable than later narratives about isolated barbarism. Evidence matters. Truth matters. But evidence becomes narrative through interpretation, and interpretation is influenced by present concerns. This isn't a flaw in historical method. It's an inherent feature of how human understanding works. We can only ask questions that make sense to us. We can only use conceptual frameworks available to us. We inevitably approach the past with assumptions shaped by our own time and place. Every generation will read the evidence somewhat differently, because every generation brings different questions and concerns to their reading. This is actually hopeful, rather than despairing. It means historical understanding can improve, biases can be recognized and corrected, new questions can reveal aspects of the past that previous generations missed. Better methods can extract information from evidence that seemed exhausted. The Merovingians weren't recovered through finding dramatically new evidence. Most of the evidence was always available. They were recovered through asking better questions of existing evidence and reading familiar sources without inherited prejudices. Consider what this means for all historical knowledge. Every narrative we inherit has been shaped by those who preserved and transmitted it. Every gap in the historical record might reflect selective preservation rather than genuine absence. Every settled understanding might be waiting for someone to question the right assumptions and see the evidence differently. This requires intellectual humility. We're all working within frameworks we inherited. We all have assumptions we haven't examined. What seems obvious to us might seem wrong to future generations, with better questions and fresher perspectives. Being thoughtful means acknowledging that our understanding is provisional, that revision is always possible, that certainty should be proportional to evidence. But it also requires courage to question established narratives, especially when they're embedded in institutional structures and supported by authoritative sources. The historians who perpetuated Carolingian propaganda about Merovingian degeneracy weren't stupid or dishonest. They were working within inherited frameworks that seemed natural to them. Questioning those frameworks required recognizing bias that was invisible to those who operated within it. The documentary's goal wasn't just to rehabilitate one dynasty's reputation. It was to model critical historical thinking, to show how to recognize narrative construction, question inherited frameworks, and follow evidence even when it contradicts familiar stories. The Merovingians are the case study, but the lesson applies broadly. Every historical narrative warrants scrutiny about who benefits from particular framings, what gets minimized or excluded, what assumptions make narratives seem natural. Every claim that a period was dark or chaotic deserves questioning. Every gap in standard narratives might hide something worth recovering. Historical truth is attainable but difficult. It requires constant vigilance against bias, including our own. It requires following evidence wherever it leads, even when uncomfortable. It requires recognizing that understanding evolves and being willing to revise when evidence demands it. The journey from the question nobody asks to the truth revealed has been about more than medieval history. It's been about learning to see how narratives work and finding courage to question them. They tried to erase an empire. They almost succeeded. But you can't unwrite 3 centuries. You can only decide whether to remember them or forget them. We've chosen to remember. Return to where we began. What existed before France? Not chaos, not darkness, not tribal wandering through ruins. The Merovingian Empire existed sophisticated, complex, influential, and now finally being recovered from historical oblivion after more than a millennium of erasure. Why don't most people know about them? Because their successors benefited from erasing their memory, and that erasure was so successful it became embedded in historical tradition, copied through centuries of manuscripts, taught in generations of classrooms, naturalized until it seemed like simple truth rather than deliberate construction. The machinery of forgetfulness operated so effectively that even discovering the evidence of Merovingian sophistication hasn't yet fully overcome the narrative momentum of their erasure. What does this mean for us? For people living 13 centuries after these events? It means we must question narratives, especially those that seem most settled and natural. It means recognizing that historical understanding is always shaped by power, relationships, and institutional biases. It means understanding that recovering suppressed histories is ongoing work that each generation must undertake anew. There's something profound about historical erasure. The Merovingians built cities where people lived and worked. They wrote laws that governed communities. They created art that expressed their values and aesthetics. They lived complex lives full of ambition, conflict, achievement, and failure. And for over 1,000 years, this was dismissed or forgotten, minimized to footnotes in histories about more important dynasties. Recovering that memory matters. Not because the Merovingian dead care about their reputation, they're beyond caring, but because every act of historical recovery is a small victory against the erasures that power attempts. Every time we restore to the historical record people and achievements that were deliberately minimized, we affirm that truth matters more than convenience, that evidence matters more than established narrative. That understanding can overcome propaganda, even when that propaganda has succeeded for centuries. The documentary's title was deliberately provocative. Why historians won't talk about the empire that existed before France. The framing suggested conspiracy or systematic suppression. The reality is more complex and more interesting. Many historians do talk about the Merovingians. Scholarly consensus is shifting. Academic publications routinely acknowledge Merovingian sophistication. The problem isn't that experts don't know, it's that expert knowledge hasn't penetrated popular understanding, that textbooks lag behind scholarship, that institutional inertia resists comprehensive narrative revision. But the provocative framing captured an important truth. For most people, in most popular histories, the Merovingians remain invisible or minimized. The gap between specialized knowledge and common understanding remains vast. This documentary has been an attempt to bridge that gap, to bring the Merovingians back into visibility, and to use their story to teach critical thinking about all historical narratives. We've learned that 300 years of sophisticated civilization can be written out of popular memory through systematic narrative control. We've learned that physical evidence survives in the ground, even when textual evidence is controlled. We've learned that scholarly revision is possible but slow, requiring courage to question established frameworks. We've learned that historical narratives serve present purposes and must be examined with that awareness. Most importantly, we've learned that the map that doesn't exist can be redrawn. We can restore what was erased. Not perfectly too much is genuinely lost. Not completely gaps in our knowledge remain, but enough to remember that the Merovingians existed, that they mattered, that their 3 centuries of rule shaped European development in ways that deserve recognition and study. Their story teaches something essential about power and memory. It reveals how thoroughly victors can control historical narrative, how completely sophisticated civilizations can be marginalized through selective emphasis and institutional bias. But it also reveals that truth survives, that evidence persists, that recovery is possible when people ask the right questions with sufficient courage and persistence. The Merovingians ruled an empire. They built cities that still stand. They created institutions that influenced everything that followed. They deserve to be remembered not as a footnote before the real history began, but as a major dynasty whose achievements and distinctive political theology shaped medieval Europe. We've chosen to remember. And in remembering, we've learned to see history differently, not as a settled body of facts, but as an ongoing investigation where every narrative deserves scrutiny and every erasure deserves recovery.